This girl doesn't belong here. Check her ticket again. Pamela Whitfield's voice sliced through the cabin like a blade, causing several passengers to look up from their phones. Her manicured finger jabbed towards 17-year-old Olivia Reynolds, who had just settled into seat 14A, a window seat in the first-class cabin of Horizon Airlines Flight 892 to Boston. Olivia froze, her MIT acceptance letter still clutched in her trembling hands. The crisp paper, her golden ticket to the prestigious quantum computing summer program, suddenly felt flimsy and inadequate as a shield against the storm of attention now directed her way. The recycled air felt suddenly thin and cold against her skin as her heart hammered in her chest. "Ma'am, what seems to be the problem?" The flight attendant, Lisa Morales, approached with practiced customer service caution, her voice low but her eyes already darting between Olivia's dark skin and Pamela's pearl necklace and Hermes scarf, unconsciously calculating the power dynamics at play. "The problem," Pamela said, emphasizing each syllable as though explaining something to a child, "is that this girl is clearly in the wrong seat. First class." She gestured around the cabin with its wider leather seats and increased legroom, the scent of pre-departure beverages already filling the air. "There must be a mistake." Olivia swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly desert dry. This couldn't be happening. Not today, not when she was finally on her way to MIT, the culmination of years of hard work and dreams. "Actually, I'm in the right seat," Olivia said, her voice steadier than she felt. She handed her boarding pass to Lisa. 14A, window seat. Lisa examined the boarding pass, her expression neutral, but her body language telling. She stood slightly closer to Pamela, angled away from Olivia in an unconscious betrayal of bias. "This does say 14A, Lisa confirmed, but her tone carried a note of surprise that stung Olivia more than Pamela's accusation. "Well, there must be a computer error," Pamela insisted, her voice rising. "Check it again. These seats are expensive. People don't just randomly get assigned first class." Around them, the cabin had grown quiet. Other first-class passengers, predominantly white business travelers in press suits and designer casual wear, were watching the scene unfold. Some had the decency to look uncomfortable. Others nodded slightly in agreement with Pamela. Olivia felt sweat beading on her forehead as dozens of eyes scrutinized her worn MIT hoodie, her comfortable leggings, her natural hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She'd dressed for the practicality of travel, not realizing she'd need to defend her right to exist in this space. "My father purchased this ticket," Olivia explained, fighting to keep her voice from trembling. She didn't want a name drop, didn't want to have to justify her presence. "It's not a mistake." "Your father," Pamela repeated, emphasizing the word with obvious skepticism. "And I suppose he's a frequent first-class traveler." Before Olivia could respond, she noticed a young woman across the aisle discreetly pointing her phone in their direction. Recording, another passenger 2 rows back was doing the same. The humiliation burned deeper. Her difficulty was becoming content for strangers, something to be scrolled past on TikTok or Instagram between cat videos and dance trends. Lisa looked increasingly uncomfortable as more eyes turned toward the confrontation. "Let me just verify this in our system," she said, pulling out a tablet from a compartment. "While you're checking," Pamela continued loudly, "you might want to make sure the ticket wasn't purchased with a stolen credit card. That happens quite a lot these days." The accusation hung in the air like toxic smoke. Olivia felt her lungs constrict, the implicit suggestion of criminality striking her like a physical blow. She'd been warned by her father about moments like this. Space is not designed for people who look like her, but experiencing it was different than hearing about it. "Excuse me," Olivia finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just saying," Pamela continued, "there are proper channels for getting upgraded. Some people try to game the system." Lisa's fingers moved across her tablet screen as other flight attendants began the pre-flight service for the remaining first-class passengers, pointedly ignoring the situation. The contrast was stark, champagne being poured 3 rows ahead, while Olivia's very presence was being treated as suspicious. "The ticket appears to be valid in our system," Lisa finally said, though her tone suggested she found this surprising. "It was purchased through our executive travel portal." "Well, there's obviously been some kind of mistake," Pamela insisted, crossing her arms. "I've been flying first class on this airline for 15 years. And I know when something isn't right. Olivia's phone vibrated in her pocket, likely her father checking if she'd boarded safely. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was physically on the plane, but nowhere near secure. A businessman across the aisle lowered his Financial Times newspaper. Is there a problem here? Some of us are trying to prepare for meetings. Yes, there's a problem, Pamela said before Lisa could respond. And I've paid far too much for this ticket to have my flight disrupted. The message was clear. Olivia's dignity was less valuable than Pamela's comfort and the businessman's convenience. The realization settled in her stomach like ice. Flight attendant intervention. Lisa's tablet chimed with an incoming message. She glanced at it, then back at Olivia with a newfound hesitation. Ms. Reynolds, would you mind coming with me for a moment? We need to clarify something about your boarding pass. Olivia felt her mouth go dry. Is there something wrong with my ticket? We just need to verify some information. Lisa said, her voice artificially pleasant. It will only take a moment. But you just said the ticket was valid, Olivia pointed out, trying to keep the rising panic from her voice. It's standard procedure, Lisa replied, though it clearly wasn't. Her eyes darted to Pamela, who was watching with barely concealed satisfaction. The cabin had grown uncomfortably quiet. Even the routine sounds of boarding, watching, the rustle of jackets being placed in overhead bins, the click of seatbelts, the soft ding of the call buttons, had diminished as passengers strained to listen. Can I see what the issue is? Olivia asked, reaching for the tablet. Lisa pulled it back reflexively. I'm sorry, but I need you to come with me to the gate desk. We can sort everything out there. Olivia remained seated, her mind racing. Getting off the plane felt dangerous. What if they didn't let her back on? What if she missed her flight to Boston and the first day of the program she had worked so hard to get into? I've already been cleared through security and boarding. Olivia said, trying to sound confident. My ticket has been scanned and verified. I don't understand why I need to leave the aircraft. Lisa's professional smile didn't reach her eyes. Ma'am, I need you to gather your belongings and come with me, she said, her voice carrying enough of an edge that several passengers looked up. The word ma'am, typically a courtesy, felt like an aging serum applied to Olivia's 17 years. It transformed her from a teenager to a problem, from a passenger to a threat. Told you, Pamela murmured to no one in particular, though loud enough for those around her to hear. They always make a scene. The casual they landed like a slap. Olivia felt her hands begin to shake with a combination of anger and humiliation. She was being reduced to a stereotype, a monolith, rather than seen as an individual with valid documentation and the right to be treated with dignity. Mark Sullivan, the gate supervisor, appeared at the front of the first-class cabin. His crisp uniform and authoritative presence immediately shifted the power dynamics further away from Olivia. Is there an issue here? He asked Lisa, though his eyes were already fixed on Olivia. We need to verify this passenger's documentation, Lisa explained, lowering her voice though not enough to prevent nearby passengers from hearing. There's been a concern raised. By whom? Olivia asked, finding her voice. My ticket is valid. You confirmed it yourself. Mark's expression remained impassive. Ms. Reynolds, we take all security concerns seriously. It will only take a few minutes to sort this out at the gate. Security concerns, Olivia repeated, the injustice burning in her chest. What about my concern that I'm being singled out for how I look, rather than any actual problem with my ticket? A middle-aged man in a business suit shook his head. Just go sort it out so the rest of us can have a peaceful flight, he muttered. Another passenger, a woman with expensive highlights in a designer laptop case, nodded in agreement. Some people always think everything is about race, she said to her seatmate, though loudly enough for Olivia to hear. The betrayal of other witnesses, their willingness to accept this treatment as normal or justified, hurt almost as much as the discrimination itself. Olivia's phone buzzed again in her pocket. Her father would be wondering why she hadn't responded. Fine, Olivia finally said, gathering her dignity along with her backpack. But I'd like my concerns noted. I've done nothing wrong. We're just following protocol, Mark insisted, though no such protocol existed for removing already boarded passengers whose tickets had been verified. Olivia stood, slipping her phone from her pocket to see 3 missed texts from her father. Did you board okay? Olivia, is everything all right? she quickly typed. Having an issue with my seat. We'll call you in a minute. As she stepped into the aisle, Pamela made a show of relaxing into her seat. Thank goodness. Now we can all have a pleasant flight. The flight attendant didn't contradict her, didn't defend Olivia, didn't acknowledge the obvious injustice unfolding. Instead, Elisa gestured toward the front of the plane. This way, please. The cabin clock displayed the time 10:22 a.m. Departure scheduled for 11 o'clock a.m., 38 minutes until takeoff. And Olivia was being marched off the plane instead of settling in for her journey. Walk of shame, the distance from seat 14A to the aircraft door had never seemed so long. Each step down the aisle felt like walking through quicksand, with dozens of eyes tracking Olivia's movement. The hushed conversations that halted as she passed, the not-so-subtle shifting of expensive handbags closer to their owners, the phones that rose to capture her humiliation, all created a gauntlet of indignities. The soft thud of her sneakers against the carpeted aisle seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed cabin. The faint scent of someone's expensive perfume mixed with the sterile airplane air as she passed row after row of averted gazes. I don't understand why this is necessary, Olivia said quietly to Mark as they approached the front of the first-class cabin. You've verified my ticket is valid. We need to check some additional details. Mark replied, his voice clipped and professional. It won't take long if everything is in order. If, the conditional hung in the air, an implicit accusation. As they passed row 5, a Hispanic man in his 40s, Carlos Rodriguez, according to the briefcase tag visible on his carry-on, looked up from his laptop. Excuse me, he called to Mark. Is there a problem with this young lady's ticket I couldn't help overhearing? Mark barely slowed his pace. Sir, we're handling a routine security verification. Everything is under control. But her ticket was already verified, Carlos persisted, his accent slight but his concern evident. I heard the flight attendant confirm it was purchased properly. Sir, please allow us to do our jobs, Mark responded, his tone making it clear that further questions were unwelcome. Olivia gave Carlos a grateful glance, touched by this small act of allyship amid the sea of indifference. He nodded slightly in return, his expression troubled. It's not right, and he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. You should at least explain what the issue is. A woman across from him shushed him. Let them handle it. There must be a reason. The assumption that authority figures must have legitimate reasons for their actions, a luxury not afforded to everyone equally, cut deep. Olivia straightened her back, determined not to physically represent the shame they were attempting to place on her. I paid for my seat just like everyone else, Olivia said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to break through. My ticket is valid. I have every right to be on this flight. A teenage girl a few rows ahead was live streaming the entire interaction, her phone held high to capture the scene. The digital witness provided cold comfort, validation that this moment was real, that it mattered, but also a reminder that her humiliation would live forever online, eternally available for strangers to dissect and comment upon. As they reached the front of the plane, the lead flight attendant, a white woman in her 50s, gave Olivia a look of thinly veiled suspicion. Boarding pass again, please, she requested, hand extended. Olivia held out the document, which had already been scanned and verified twice. There's nothing wrong with my ticket. The flight attendant examined it closely, turning it over as though secrets might be written on the back. And your ID. Olivia pulled her driver's license from her wallet, the frustration building. Each request for verification after verification created a spectacle that reinforced the narrative that she didn't belong. Her father's voice echoed in her mind from countless conversations. You'll have to work twice as hard to get half as far, and when you succeed, they'll look for any reason to question whether you earned it. The truth of those words had never been more evident than in this moment. Standing at the threshold of the aircraft while her documentation was scrutinized yet again. Ms. Reynolds, if you could please come with us to the gate, Mark said, gesturing toward the jet bridge. We need to verify some information about your reservation. What information specifically? Olivia asked, finding strength in precision. My ticket has been confirmed as valid. I've shown my ID. What exactly is the issue? Mark's expression hardened at the direct question. Ma'am, we have procedures to follow when concerns are raised about a passenger's documentation. If everything is in order, you'll be able to board again before departure. If, again, the conditional promise hung between them. This is about that woman's complaint, isn't it? Olivia said, lowering her voice to avoid creating more of a scene. She didn't think I belonged in first class. And instead of addressing her prejudice, "You're punishing me." "No one is being punished," Mark said, though his tone lacked conviction. "We're simply responding to a concern raised by another passenger. A concern based on what? The fact that I'm black in a space she thinks I don't belong in?" The words hung in the air, the unspoken truth finally given voice. Mark's uncomfortable silence was answer enough. Olivia looked back down the aisle one last time. Most passengers were now deliberately avoiding eye contact, suddenly fascinated by their phones or the safety cards in their seatback pockets. A few were still watching openly, curious about how the drama would resolve. Pamela Whitfield sat smugly in her seat, already motioning to a flight attendant for a pre-departure beverage. With a deep breath, Olivia stepped off the aircraft onto the jet bridge. The moment the door closed behind her, separating her from the other passengers, Mark's demeanor shifted subtly. "Your boarding pass, please," he said, holding out his hand. Olivia hesitated. "You've already seen it multiple times." "I need to take it to the gate to verify some information," Mark insisted. With growing unease, Olivia handed over her boarding pass, her physical claim to the seat she had rightfully purchased. Mark took it and nodded toward the terminal. "Wait here, can you be sure?" he instructed, already turning toward the gate desk. "I'd rather come with you to resolve whatever the issue is," Olivia said, taking a step forward. "Ma'am, please wait here while we sort this out," Mark repeated, more firmly this time. Olivia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She was being separated from her documentation, left in limbo on a jet bridge, while decisions about her future were being made without her input. "I'd like to call my father," she said, pulling out her phone. "That's fine," Mark replied dismissively, already walking away with her boarding pass in hand. Olivia watched him disappear through the door to the terminal, the distance between her and her seat on the plane growing with each passing second. She was neither on the aircraft nor in the terminal, suspended in an in-between space both literally and figuratively, with trembling fingers. She dialed her father's number. As the phone rang, she looked through the small window in the jet bridge door. Inside the terminal, she could see Mark speaking with another gate agent, her boarding pass placed on the counter between them. Their expressions were serious, their glances toward the jet bridge furtive. The line connected. "Olivia, everything okay?" Her father's voice was a lifeline to normalcy, to a world where she was valued and respected. "Dad," she said, her composure finally cracking. "They made me get off the plane." Part 2, Background and Characterization. The acceptance letter from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Quantum Computing Summer Initiative had arrived on a rainy Tuesday in April. Olivia had stared at the email for a full 5 minutes, afraid to open it, afraid to hope. When she finally clicked, the words, "We are pleased to inform you," had sent her screaming through the house, her socks sliding on the hardwood floors as she raced to find her parents. Only 12 high school students nationwide had been selected. The program would put her in direct contact with leading researchers in quantum algorithms, potentially setting her on a path to revolutionize medical diagnostic computing. Her dream, since her grandmother had been misdiagnosed with pneumonia when she actually had lung cancer 3 years earlier. By the time they caught the error, it was too late. Olivia had made a promise at the funeral she would create systems that never made such mistakes again. Olivia's journey to that acceptance letter had been paved with late nights hunched over textbooks, weekends sacrificed to science competitions, and countless hours in the computer lab teaching herself programming languages that weren't offered in her school curriculum. "This is it," she'd texted her best friend Jasmine that night. "Actual quantum computers. Like, not simulations, but the real thing. I might actually die from excitement. Not even joking." Her high school's resources had been limited until her junior year, when they'd relocated to a more affluent district following her father's business success. But Olivia had never waited for perfect conditions to pursue excellence. She'd started coding at 11 on a second-hand laptop, teaching herself Python from free online courses while her classmates were discovering social media. By 14, she'd created a rudimentary algorithm to help organize her father's business inventory, a small contribution to what would later become Reynolds Quantum Systems' revolutionary logistics platform. At 15, she'd won the National Youth Science Foundation Award for her proposal on quantum applications in medical imaging, beating students from the most elite prep schools in the country. Despite her father's growing success, Olivia remained grounded. She still carried the same worn backpack she'd had since ninth grade, covered now with pins and badges from science competitions across the country. It was a reminder of where she'd started and how far she'd come through her own merit. "That backpack is falling apart," her mother had said just yesterday while helping her pack. "It's good luck," Olivia had replied, running her fingers over the pins. "It's been with me for everything important." Her mother, Denise Reynolds, had instilled in her a sense of responsibility that transcended personal achievement. "Your brilliance isn't just for you," she'd often say. "It's a tool to lift others." This philosophy had shaped Olivia's research interests, focusing her considerable talents on healthcare algorithms that could make advanced diagnostics more accessible to underserved communities. The summer program at MIT represented not just personal opportunity, but validation. It was proof that her ideas had value, that her voice deserved to be heard in rooms where the future of technology was being shaped. The quantum computing field was still overwhelmingly white and male, a fact not lost on Olivia as she prepared for the program. "You'll probably be the only black girl there," her mother had said while helping her pack. It wasn't a discouragement, but a preparation, a truth they both understood. "Then I better be so good they can't ignore me." Olivia had responded with the quiet determination that characterized her approach to obstacles. This determination had fueled her preparation for the summer program. She'd spent weeks studying advanced quantum theory beyond her grade level, determined to arrive at MIT not just ready to learn, but ready to contribute. Her notes were meticulous, her questions thoughtfully prepared, her project proposals outlined with the precision of a seasoned researcher rather than a high school student. The night before her flight, she'd carefully packed her laptop, her notebooks, and the small family photo that traveled with her to every competition, her parents and younger brother beaming with pride after her first science fair win in 7th grade. It was a talisman of sorts, a reminder of the support system that made her achievements possible. Olivia had always been conscious of the dual burden she carried. Excellence was not just a personal goal, but a necessary armor against the lower expectations often placed on her because of her race and gender. While her white peers could make mistakes and be seen as individuals, she knew that any error would risk being viewed as representative of broader stereotypes. This awareness created a careful duality in her personality. Among friends and family, Olivia was quick-witted and warmly confident. Her intelligence worn comfortably like a favorite sweater. In new environments, particularly academic spaces where she was often the only person who looked like her, she became more measured, more deliberate, calculating each contribution to ensure it reflected her best self. "Sometimes it's exhausting," she'd confided to Jasmine once. "Having to be perfect just to be seen as adequate." "Then don't be," Jasmine had replied. "Just be you. That's enough." But they both knew it wasn't that simple. The MIT summer program was meant to be her stepping stone to the future she'd envisioned: undergraduate studies in computer science with a focus on quantum computing, graduate work in medical applications of AI, and eventually founding her own company developing diagnostic tools for underserved communities worldwide. Standing now on the jet bridge of Flight 892, her boarding pass taken from her hands and her seat on the plane in jeopardy, Olivia felt the weight of this future suddenly balanced on the prejudice of a single passenger and the complicity of airline staff who should have protected her rights. The unfairness burned in her chest. She'd done everything right. She'd worked harder than anyone she knew. She'd earned her place, not just on this flight, but in the program waiting for her in Boston. And with a single complaint, a woman who knew nothing about her had threatened to derail it all. As she waited for her father to respond to her news, Olivia watched through the small window as Mark showed her boarding pass to another gate agent, their heads bent together in discussion. The seconds stretched into a small eternity, each one carrying her further from her carefully planned future and the opportunity she'd worked so hard to secure. James Reynolds' rise to power. James Reynolds had not been born into money or connections. His childhood in the housing projects of West Baltimore had been defined by economic insecurity, but rich in determination and intelligence. His mother, a nurse's aide working double shifts, had instilled in him both a voracious appetite for knowledge and an unshakable belief that education was the one ladder no one could take away. "They can take your job, your house, even your dignity if you let them," she would tell him, often after returning home with her uniform stained from a 12-hour shift. "But what's in your head, that's yours forever." At 12, James had started his first business, fixing neighbors' electronic devices with parts salvaged from discarded equipment. By 16, he was taking community college courses in computer science while still in high school, juggling his education with part-time jobs that helped support his family. In those early years, James had his first experiences with the prejudice that would follow him throughout his career. At 17, he developed a simple inventory tracking system for the convenience store where he worked, dramatically reducing the losses and streamlining ordering. The owner had been impressed enough to implement the system, but refused James's request for a raise. "Anyone could have thought of this," the owner had said dismissively. 2 weeks later, James discovered the owner taking credit for his innovative inventory solution to secure a small business award. It was an early, painful lesson in how achievement could be undermined or appropriated based on who you were rather than what you contributed, a lesson that would shape his approach to his daughter's education and protection years later. The path had never been easy. He'd worked 3 jobs simultaneously to put himself through Howard University: night security guard, weekend tech support, and early morning stocking at a local grocery store. Sleep became a luxury, but James treated every obstacle as a problem to be solved rather than a barrier to stop him. His breakthrough had come during his senior year at Howard, when he developed a revolutionary approach into logistics software that could predict supply chain disruptions before they occurred. The algorithm, inspired by watching ants navigate around obstacles to find food, had caught the attention of a small venture capital firm specializing in minority-owned tech startups. With their initial investment of $250,000, Reynolds Logistics Solutions was born in a tiny office in Baltimore with a staff of 2, James and his college roommate. The early years had been lean and challenging. Established companies were skeptical of the young Black entrepreneur with his revolutionary ideas. Meetings where James presented his technology often ended with executives suggesting he work through a more established partner or consider selling the patent. Thinly veiled attempts to separate the brilliant innovation from the innovator they couldn't quite accept. "We'd be happy to license your algorithm," one potential investor had told him, leaning back in his expensive chair. "You could make a tidy sum and leave the business side to people with experience, Mom." "You mean leave it to people who look like you," James had replied evenly, closing his presentation folder. "I'm not interested in being the help. I'm building a company." But James had refused all offers that didn't recognize his leadership. "I'm not just selling an algorithm," he'd told a particularly persistent potential buyer. "I'm building a company that will change how the world moves goods." His insistence on maintaining control had cost him several potentially lucrative partnerships. There had been months when he couldn't make payroll, when he'd gone without salary to keep his small team intact, when he'd questioned whether his refusal to compromise was worth the struggle. The turning point came when a global shipping crisis left thousands of containers stranded across major ports worldwide. Companies using traditional logistics software were paralyzed, unable to reroute shipments efficiently. Reynolds Logistics, with its predictive capabilities, had helped a mid-sized client navigate the crisis with minimal disruption. That success story had spread through the industry like wildfire. Within 5 years, Reynolds Logistics had evolved into Reynolds Quantum Systems, expanding beyond shipping to revolutionize supply chain management across industries. The company grew from 2 employees to 200, then to over 1,000. Its headquarters relocated from Baltimore to a gleaming tower in Manhattan, with satellite offices in London, Singapore, and Johannesburg. James's personal wealth had grown accordingly. The boy who once fixed discarded electronics to help pay rent was now worth $3.8 billion. Forbes had featured him on its cover, calling him the supply chain seer. Wall Street analysts tracked his company's innovations with the attention once reserved for tech giants like Apple and Google. But success had not changed James's fundamental character or values. He remained deeply committed to creating opportunities for others from similar backgrounds. Reynolds Quantum Systems maintained one of the most diverse workforces in the tech industry, with targeted recruitment from HBCUs and community colleges in underserved areas. The company's charitable foundation funded STEM education in inner-city schools, with a particular focus on introducing girls and minority students to computer science before high school. James personally mentored young entrepreneurs from disadvantaged backgrounds, offering not just funding, but the guidance he wished he'd had when starting out. His experiences with discrimination hadn't ended with success. They had simply transformed. Now, instead of being dismissed as unqualified, he was often treated as an exception, the good one, who had somehow transcended his race rather than succeeded because of his own merit while overcoming systemic barriers. At a tech industry gala the previous year, a venture capitalist had clapped him on the back after several drinks. "You know, Reynolds, when I first met you, I didn't expect much. But you're different. You think like we do." James had fixed him with a level gaze. "No, I think like me. And perhaps you should consider that your expectations, not my capabilities, were the problem." Such encounters had reinforced his determination to create a different experience for his children. He provided Olivia and her younger brother Marcus with resources far beyond what he had had access to growing up. But he also ensured they understood the privilege of their position and the obligation it carried. "Excellence is the best response to prejudice," he often told them. "But excellence alone isn't enough. You also need to create systems that give others a fair chance to be excellent too." This perspective had shaped how James navigated predominantly white spaces as his wealth and influence grew. He recognized that even in the most elite business environments, he was often still viewed through the lens of race first, accomplishments second. Rather than allowing this reality to embitter him, he had channeled it into strategic thinking about how to dismantle barriers systematically. His approach to discrimination was calculated rather than reactive. When a prestigious Manhattan co-op board had attempted to block his family's purchase of a penthouse apartment through a series of increasingly absurd requirements, James hadn't filed a lawsuit. Instead, he'd purchased the entire building through a shell corporation and replaced the board. The message was clear: prejudice would not be tolerated, and consequences would be proportional and strategic. This same strategic thinking had informed how he prepared his children for the world they would navigate. He'd never sheltered them from the realities of racism, but had equipped them with both the confidence to know their worth and the tools to respond effectively when that worth was questioned. For Olivia specifically, he'd recognized her brilliant mind early and nurtured it without pushing her toward his own field. When she discovered her passion for quantum computing and its medical applications, he'd supported her with resources, but insisted she earn her opportunities on merit alone. Her acceptance to the MIT summer program had been secured without his name or influence, a point of particular pride for them both. "You'll encounter people who won't see your brilliance," he'd told her the night before her flight, helping her pack her final items. "People who will look at you and see only what they expect to see based on how you look. Your job isn't to convince them otherwise." "Then what is my job?" Olivia had asked. "To be so exceptional they become irrelevant," he'd replied, "and to help build systems where others don't have to be exceptional, just to be treated with basic dignity." Now, hearing his daughter's voice crack as she explained what was happening on Flight 892, James felt a cold, focused anger crystallize in his chest. This was not just about one flight or one program. It was about his daughter's right to occupy spaces she had earned through her own excellence, without having that right questioned because of how she looked. In his corner office overlooking Manhattan, James set his coffee cup down deliberately. His executive assistant, Maria Hernandez, looked up at his sudden stillness, recognizing the shift in his demeanor instantly. "Olivia," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel that his business associates had learned to recognize as dangerous. "I need you to tell me exactly what happened, from the beginning." As Olivia recounted the humiliation she'd endured, James made a single gesture to Maria, who immediately understood. This was a Reynolds Protocol 3 situation, a family emergency requiring immediate mobilization of company resources. While Olivia spoke, Maria was already sending the necessary alerts, setting in motion a response that would soon make Horizon Airlines regret ever allowing Pamela Whitfield's prejudice to dictate their actions. Pamela Whitfield's entitlement. Pamela Whitfield had been born into the kind of old money that whispered rather than shouted. Her family name adorned a small building at Princeton and was engraved on a plaque at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, though their actual fortune had been steadily declining for generations. By the time Pamela inherited what remained of the family assets, it was enough to maintain appearances, but not the true wealth her grandparents had enjoyed. The Whitfield name had once opened doors throughout Manhattan society, but those doors had grown increasingly reluctant in recent decades as newer, more substantial fortunes eclipsed the fading glory of old family connections. This gradual loss of social currency had left Pamela with a perpetual anxiety about status, a desperate need to assert her place in hierarchies she increasingly struggled to maintain. "Do you know who I am?" had become her reflexive response to any challenge, though the question was increasingly met with genuine lack of recognition rather than the deference she expected. This precarious relationship with status had shaped her into someone obsessively concerned with the markers of class and position. Her Hermès scarves and Cartier watches weren't just accessories but armor, protecting her from the reality of her diminishing relevance in a changing world. "It's not about the things themselves," she'd once confided to her therapist during a session focused on her anxiety. "It's about what they represent. When I walk into a room wearing the right brands, people know I belong there." "And what would happen if you weren't wearing those signals?" her therapist had asked. Pamela had been unable to answer, the prospect too threatening to contemplate. At 55, Pamela had built her identity around membership in exclusive spaces, charity boards where she contributed more opinions than donations, country clubs where she insisted on enforcing increasingly arcane dress codes, and first-class cabins where she could perform her status for a captive audience. Her consulting firm, Whitfield Excellency, specialized in corporate etiquette and traditional values training for companies that were often seeking to maintain rather than challenge established hierarchies. Her client list had once included Fortune 500 companies, but in recent years had dwindled to smaller firms and startups seeking a veneer of old-world sophistication. "What we offer isn't just etiquette training," she would tell potential clients. "It's access to a world of tradition and excellence that has been increasingly diluted in our casual, merit-obsessed culture." The irony that her own position had been entirely inherited rather than earned was lost on Pamela. In her worldview, certain people belonged in certain spaces because of who they were, not what they had accomplished, a perspective that made the sight of a young black woman in first class inherently disruptive to her sense of proper order. The world was changing around Pamela, and she resented every shift. Diversity initiatives were lowering standards. Remote work was destroying proper business culture. Young entrepreneurs in hoodies with billions in funding were accidental successes rather than worthy inheritors of power. "In my day," she often began, despite being too young to justify such phrasing, "there was a proper way to do things. People knew their place." Her personal life reflected this same resistance to change. Divorced twice, both ex-husbands had eventually tired of her rigidity and constant status anxiety. Her adult daughter, Catherine, had gradually reduced contact after Pamela had criticized her choice to work for a nonprofit instead of pursuing a proper career in finance or law. "You're squandering generations of connections," Pamela had told Catherine during their last significant argument. "Do you have any idea how many people would kill for the doors the Whitfield name could open for you?" "Maybe I want to open my own doors," Catherine had replied. "And maybe I'm tired of rooms that only certain people are allowed to enter." Even Pamela's social circle had contracted as former friends embraced more progressive views or simply grew tired of her constant complaints about declining standards. She maintained a carefully curated social media presence, showing her at exclusive events and high-end restaurants. But the reality behind these images was increasingly lonely. Her Instagram feed showed her at gallery openings and charity galas, but carefully cropped out the fact that she was often attending alone. Her LinkedIn posts about maintaining excellence in changing times received polite engagement, but rarely led to the consulting contracts she desperately needed to maintain her lifestyle. The first-class cabin of flights like Horizon 892 had become one of the few spaces where Pamela could reliably perform her status without challenge. Flight attendants were trained to be deferential. Fellow passengers generally kept to themselves. The controlled environment allowed her to feel, for a few hours, like the world still operated according to the hierarchies she understood and benefited from. When Olivia Reynolds had appeared in seat 14A, Pamela's reaction had been instinctive rather than calculated. The sight of a young black woman in casual clothing occupying a first-class seat violated her sense of the natural order. Rather than questioning her own assumptions, she had immediately assumed a mistake had been made. The fact that Olivia was clearly a teenager had only reinforced Pamela's certainty. In her worldview, first class was reserved for business executives, wealthy retirees, and the occasional celebrity, not young people from backgrounds she considered beneath her notice. What Pamela couldn't have known was that her impulsive decision to challenge Olivia's presence would intersect catastrophically with her already precarious professional situation. 3 major clients had recently informed Whitfield Excellence that they would not be renewing their contracts, citing a desire for more contemporary approaches to professional development. Her company's cash reserves were dwindling. The Manhattan office lease was coming up for renewal, and the increased rate would stretch her finances to the breaking point. The carefully constructed facade of success and influence was on the verge of collapse. Had Pamela been more secure in her position, perhaps she would have simply ignored Olivia's presence. But insecurity breeds defensiveness, and Pamela's need to assert control in one of the few environments where she still felt entitled to authority overwhelmed any better judgment she might have exercised. As Flight 892 prepared for departure, Pamela sat smugly in her seat, believing she had successfully defended the exclusivity of the first-class cabin. She had no idea that her actions had set in motion a chain of events that would not only expose her prejudice to the world, but accelerate the unraveling of the professional and social standing she so desperately clung to. When the flight attendant approached with her requested pre-departure champagne, Pamela accepted it with the entitled air of someone who believed they had successfully maintained order in their small corner of the world. The bubbles fizzed in the plastic flute as she took a satisfied sip, unaware that across town, James Reynolds was already mobilizing resources that would soon make her name synonymous with the consequences of casual racism in the digital age. Airport operations and hierarchy. Kennedy International Airport operated like a small city, with its own complex social hierarchies, power structures, and unwritten rules. On this particular Monday morning, the usual controlled chaos was in full swing, with 247 departures scheduled before noon alone. In the airport's operational control center, Director Victoria Alvarez supervised the intricate dance of arrivals, departures, gate assignments, and ground transportation with the calm efficiency that had made her one of the youngest airport directors in the country. At 38, the daughter of Mexican immigrants who had both worked in airport services, Victoria had risen through the ranks on a combination of technical expertise and political savvy. The vast room hummed with the soft glow of dozens of monitors displaying everything from weather patterns to runway conditions, baggage handling statistics to security checkpoint wait times. The air smelled faintly of coffee and the ozone scent of electronics, a backdrop to the low murmur of professionals managing thousands of moving parts in perfect synchronization. Runway 13R31L is showing some debris near taxiway Kilo, she noted, addressing a junior operations manager without looking up from her monitors. Get a maintenance team out there before it affects departures. The operations center hummed with the low voices of staff coordinating everything from baggage handling to customs processing. Massive screens displayed weather patterns, flight statuses, and security alerts. Victoria's domain was one where precision and protocol reigned supreme. Human factors were variables to be managed rather than emotions to be considered. 3 floors below, in the air traffic control tower, Nathan Peterson guided aircraft through the complex aerial choreography with practiced confidence. After 15 years directing traffic at one of the world's busiest airports, he had developed an almost supernatural awareness of where each aircraft was and should be. Horizon 892. You are cleared to push back from gate 42. Follow ground guidance to runway 31L for departure, he instructed, his voice carrying the clipped professionalism that pilots responded to automatically. Through the tower's wraparound windows, the sprawling concrete ecosystem of runways and taxiways spread before him like a vast board game, with aircraft of all sizes moving in precise patterns. The morning sun glinted off the metal bodies of planes, creating momentary flashes of brilliance against the gray backdrop of tarmac. Nathan's position granted him significant authority within the airport's operational hierarchy. Air traffic controllers were the high priests of aviation safety, their word rarely questioned by pilots or ground crew. This authority came with enormous responsibility. A single miscommunication could have catastrophic consequences, but also with a certain insularity. The tower operated according to its own rules and rhythms, somewhat removed from the human dramas playing out in terminals and aircraft cabins. On the ground level, the terminal operations staff dealt with the messier human elements of air travel. Gate agents like Mark Sullivan occupied an awkward middle position in the airport hierarchy. They lacked the technical authority of air traffic controllers or the operational power of directors like Victoria Alvarez, but they exercised considerable discretion over individual passengers' travel experiences. This discretionary power was both a tool and a trap. Gate agents like Mark could make exceptions to rules for some passengers while strictly enforcing them for others. This flexibility, meant to address unique situations, also created space for biases to influence decision-making with little oversight. The social dynamics within Horizon Airlines reflected these same hierarchical structures. Flight attendants like Lisa Morales navigated a complex position, responsible for safety, but evaluated on customer service. Technically in charge of the cabin, but expected to defer to first-class passengers' preferences, especially frequent flyers who represented significant revenue for the airline. The company says safety first, but what they reward is keeping high-value customers happy. A veteran flight attendant had once told Lisa during her training, "You'll learn to read the room, who matters and who doesn't in their eyes." This system created predictable pressure points where bias could flourish. When Pamela Whitfield had raised her concern about Olivia Reynolds' presence in first class, she had activated a cascade of unspoken calculations among the Horizon staff. First, Pamela fit their mental model of a valuable customer: older, white, expensively dressed, apparently affluent. Second, Olivia did not fit their mental model of a typical first-class passenger: young, black, casually dressed. Third, the path of least resistance was to remove the passenger who seemed out of place, rather than challenge the one who seemed to belong. None of these calculations was made consciously or maliciously. They were the result of systemic biases built into the operating procedures of the airline and the broader culture of commercial aviation. The fact that Olivia's ticket was verified as valid was less influential in the staff's decision-making than the unspoken social calculations about who belonged in which spaces. This same phenomenon played out thousands of times daily across airports worldwide. Security personnel were more likely to flag certain passengers for random screening. Gate agents were more likely to strictly enforce baggage policies for some travelers while allowing exceptions for others. Flight attendants unconsciously provided more attentive service to passengers who matched their mental model of important customers. I once watched a flight attendant spend 5 minutes helping a white businessman stow his bag properly. An African-American pilot had recounted during a diversity training session. 10 minutes later, she told a black woman with the same issue to check her bag or miss the flight. Same bag, same compartment, completely different treatment. As Olivia stood in limbo on the jet bridge and Mark reviewed her boarding pass at the gate desk, these systemic forces were operating exactly as designed. The system wasn't failing. It was functioning according to its implicit biases, treating Olivia as a problem to be managed rather than a passenger to be served. What none of the Horizon Airlines staff realized was that their actions were about to collide with a force outside their familiar hierarchy. James Reynolds operated according to different rules and with resources that could disrupt the entire carefully balanced system of airport operations. As Victoria Alvarez reviewed departure schedules and Nathan Peterson cleared aircraft for takeoff, neither had any indication that within the hour, their orderly system would be thrown into chaos by a single private jet and the determination of a father unwilling to accept his daughter's mistreatment. The airport's rigid hierarchies and protocols were about to face a reckoning from someone who understood systems well enough to know exactly how to break them when necessary. Part 3, Initial Response and Escalation. They made me get off the plane. "Dad!" Olivia's voice trembled despite her best efforts to maintain composure. The jet bridge felt suddenly colder, the recycled air raising goosebumps on her arms as she stood alone in the sterile, tunnel-like space. Through the small window, she could see Mark and another gate agent huddled over her boarding pass, their expressions serious. "What do you mean off the plane?" James Reynolds' tone was measured. But Olivia could hear the dangerous undercurrent. It was the voice he used when suppliers failed to deliver or executives presented excuses instead of solutions. Calm on the surface, but with unmistakable steel beneath. Olivia leaned against the wall of the jet bridge, Suddenly exhausted by the effort of holding herself together, she explained the situation in detail. Pamela's complaints, Lisa's initial verification of her ticket, Mark's insistence that she deplane for additional verification. A woman in first class, Pamela something. She complained about me being there, Olivia explained, the words tumbling out faster as her careful composure began to crack. She kept saying I didn't belong, that my ticket must be fake or bought with a stolen credit card. The flight attendant checked and confirmed my ticket was valid, but then they still asked me to get off the plane to verify something. They confirmed your ticket was valid but still removed you, James repeated, his voice now perfectly, dangerously controlled. Yes, Olivia said, a hot tear finally escaping despite her efforts. She wiped it away quickly, angry at herself for the display of weakness. The gate agent took my boarding pass and went back into the terminal. He told me to wait here on the jet bridge. Through the phone, Olivia could hear her father's measured breathing. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. The technique he used when processing information that would normally trigger an immediate reaction. Are you recording this? He asked after a moment. No, Olivia admitted. I didn't think to. Start now, James instructed. Use your phone to document everything, every conversation, every instruction they give you. Note the time, names if they provide them, positions if they don't. Olivia nodded, then remembered he couldn't see her. Okay. Where exactly are you right now? On the jet bridge between the plane and the terminal. The supervisor took my boarding pass into the terminal to verify something. I can see him through the window talking to another agent. James was silent for a moment, and Olivia could picture him at his desk, already formulating multiple strategies. It was how his mind worked, not just solving problems, but anticipating 3 moves ahead. What time is your departure scheduled for? He asked. 11? Olivia replied, checking her watch. About 30 minutes from now. And the flight number, Horizon Airlines 892 to Boston. Another brief silence, filled only by the sound of rapid typing. Olivia knew her father was already accessing information, leveraging the resources at his disposal. Olivia, James said finally, his voice softer now. I need you to listen carefully. What's happening right now is not about you. It's not about anything you did wrong or right. It's about their assumptions and prejudices. Do you understand? The kindness in his tone nearly broke her composure entirely. It was one thing to face discrimination. It was another to have someone fully acknowledge it without question or hesitation. I understand, she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Good. Now here's what you're going to do. When that gate agent returns, you will calmly but firmly ask what specific verification they need that hasn't already been provided. Record the conversation. If they return your boarding pass and allow you to board, do so. If they continue to delay or deny you boarding, do not argue or escalate. Simply ask for written documentation of why you're being denied boarding on a flight with a valid ticket. Okay, Olivia said, standing straighter. Having a clear protocol to follow helped restore her sense of agency. I've already set things in motion on my end, James continued. Maria is contacting Horizon's executive offices now. I'm also accessing our company's security feeds through our airport logistics contract. This didn't surprise Olivia. Reynolds Quantum Systems maintained contracts with major transportation hubs worldwide, providing logistics software that often integrated with security systems. Her father's ability to access certain camera feeds was likely completely legal through these service agreements, if unorthodox. What if they don't let me back on the plane? Olivia asked, voicing her deepest fear. Missing the first day of the MIT program would be devastating after how hard she'd worked to get there. Then they will learn exactly what happens when they discriminate against my daughter, James replied, his tone making it clear this wasn't mere parental bravado. But right now, focus on documenting everything and maintaining your composure. Your dignity is non-negotiable. Olivia, remember that. The jet bridge door opened, and Mark Sullivan reappeared, still holding her boarding pass. His expression was unreadable. He's coming back, Olivia whispered into the phone. Start recording now, James instructed. I'm staying on the line. Olivia quickly switched her phone to recording mode while keeping the call active. She straightened her shoulders and prepared to face whatever came next, fortified by the knowledge that her father, a man who had built an empire by understanding systems and how to transform them when necessary, was already working to ensure justice would follow this moment of injustice. As Mark approached, his face carefully neutral, Olivia felt a strange calm settle over her. This was no longer just about a seat on a plane or even making it to MIT on time. It had become something larger, a moment that would test not just her resilience, but the systems that were supposed to treat all passengers with equal dignity and respect. Ms. Reynolds, Mark began, still holding her boarding pass. We've reviewed your reservation and— Excuse me, Olivia interrupted politely but firmly, just as her father had taught her. Before we continue, could you please state your name and position for the record? I'm documenting this interaction. Mark blinked, clearly thrown by the composed, professional response from the teenager he had expected to be intimidated and compliant. In that small moment of surprise, the power dynamics shifted ever so slightly, a preview of the much larger shift that was already being set in motion by her father's quiet fury and strategic brilliance. James Reynolds' immediate action. The moment Olivia confirmed she was recording, James Reynolds pressed a button on his desk intercom. Maria, initiate Protocol Delta. Immediately, his executive assistant, Maria Hernandez, had worked with James for 7 years. She didn't need further explanation. Protocol Delta was the company's highest-level response to a situation involving family security or well-being. It had been used exactly twice before, once when James's mother had needed emergency medical evacuation from a cruise ship, and once when his son Marcus had been followed by suspicious vehicles after school. Maria was already moving, her fingers flying across her keyboard as she activated a series of predetermined responses. First, she sent alerts to the company's legal team, security division, and aviation department. Second, she initiated contact with the Horizon Airlines executive offices through multiple channels simultaneously: email, phone, and direct messages to executives James had relationships with. Sir, Maria said quietly as she worked. Should I alert Mrs. Reynolds? James considered for a moment. Not yet. Denise is in surgery until noon. Let's handle this first and brief her after. His wife, a neurosurgeon at New York Presbyterian, would want to know about the situation, but there was nothing she could do while in the operating room. Better to resolve it first and spare her the distress of being unable to help while performing delicate surgery. Meanwhile, James opened his secure laptop and entered a series of authentication codes. Reynolds Quantum Systems logistics software was integrated into Kennedy Airport's operational systems, providing real-time tracking of cargo and baggage. This integration included limited access to certain security camera feeds for troubleshooting purposes, a feature that was completely legal under their service contract, but rarely utilized directly by the CEO. Within seconds, James had visual access to the gate area where Flight 892 was preparing for departure. He quickly located the feed showing the jet bridge entrance where his daughter stood, phone in hand, facing the gate agent who had taken her boarding pass. The image was clear enough to read the agent's name badge, Sullivan. James watched the interaction unfold in real time, noting Olivia's composed demeanor despite the situation. Pride mingled with anger as he observed his daughter handling herself with a dignity far beyond her 17 years, a dignity she shouldn't have had to summon in the first place. Michael, James said into his phone, connecting to the head of his aviation division. Prepare the G850 for immediate departure to Boston. Priority clearance. I'll be flying. Sir, the G850 is currently being serviced, Michael Davis replied. The G700 is fueled and ready on standby. Then the G700 it is. I need it on the tarmac in 15 minutes. And Michael, I'll need a specific flight plan. Yes, sir. What's the situation? Olivia has been removed from her commercial flight due to racial profiling. We're going to ensure she reaches Boston today, one way or another. There was a brief pause before Michael responded. Understood, sir. The G700 will be ready. Should I prepare for additional passengers? No, James replied, his eyes still fixed on the security feed. Just me and potentially Olivia, depending on how this plays out. James ended the call and turned his attention back to his daughter's situation. On screen, he could see Olivia standing straight, her posture betraying none of the distress he had heard in her voice. Pride mixed with anger in his chest. His daughter shouldn't have to be this strong, this composed, this professional, not at 17, not when she was simply trying to take a flight she had a valid ticket for. He recalled a similar incident from his own early career, when he'd been denied entry to a tech conference despite having a paid registration. The organizers had assumed he was maintenance staff rather than a presenting entrepreneur. He'd had to produce multiple forms of ID and verification emails before being grudgingly admitted, 15 minutes into his own scheduled presentation. That humiliation had stayed with him for years, a persistent reminder that no matter how successful he became, certain people would always question his right to occupy certain spaces. He had vowed then that his children would never face such treatment without consequence, a vow he was now preparing to fulfill with all the resources at his disposal. A notification appeared on his screen. The company's legal team was assembled on a conference line, awaiting his input. James connected while continuing to monitor the security feed. "Eleanor," he addressed the chief legal counsel, "I need immediate action. My daughter Olivia has been removed from Horizon Airlines Flight 892 at Kennedy after a white passenger complained about her presence in first class. Her ticket was verified as valid, but they removed her from the aircraft anyway and are currently preventing her from reboarding." Eleanor Williams, a formidable attorney who had helped Reynolds Quantum Systems navigate complex international regulations for over a decade, didn't waste time on expressions of sympathy or outrage. "I'm dispatching Jonathan to Kennedy now," she said, referring to one of their top litigation specialists. "We'll need documentation of everything: times, names, specific statements made. Is Olivia recording?" "Yes, as of 2 minutes ago." "Good. We'll need her to request written documentation if they deny her boarding. Specifically, she should ask for the name and title of the decision maker and the specific regulation or policy they're citing." "She's already requested the agent's name and position," James noted with pride, watching the security feed where Mark Sullivan appeared increasingly uncomfortable under Olivia's composed questioning. "Perfect. Meanwhile, we're drafting communications to Horizon's legal department citing multiple violations of federal transportation regulations and civil rights statutes. We'll have it ready to deploy within 5 minutes if needed." James nodded, even though Eleanor couldn't see him. "Be prepared for either outcome. If they allow her to reboard, we still proceed with formal complaints and demand policy changes. If they prevent her from boarding, we escalate to immediate legal action." "Understood." And James, try to breathe. "We'll handle this." James ended the call and returned his full attention to the security feeds. He could see that a small crowd of passengers was gathering near the gate, some with phones out, apparently recording the situation. Word was spreading, exactly as he had anticipated. In today's connected world, incidents like this couldn't be easily contained or dismissed. His secure phone chimed with a message from Maria, Horizon executive offices, acknowledging contact, requesting details of situation. James typed back, "Tell them their gate agent Sullivan at gate 42 has removed a minor with a valid first-class ticket from flight 892 after another passenger objected to her presence based on racial bias. Inform them I am monitoring the situation personally and expect immediate corrective action." As he sent the message, James opened another screen on his laptop, accessing the airport's operational data through his company's logistics platform. Flight 892 was still showing an on-time departure of 11 o'clock a.m. The G700, his private jet, was currently positioned in the private aviation section of the airport, approximately 15 minutes from being ready for departure. A third screen displayed a map of the airport's runways and taxiways. James studied it carefully, his mind calculating distances, timing, and potential choke points. Unlike most people, who saw airports as confusing mazes of terminals and gates, James understood them as complex systems with specific vulnerabilities and pressure points. His father had taught him chess when he was 6 years old, emphasizing the importance of controlling the center of the board and recognizing when to sacrifice a piece for strategic advantage. Those lessons had shaped his approach to business and problem-solving throughout his life. Now he was mentally positioning his pieces on the airport's complex grid, preparing a move that would force Horizon Airlines into checkmate. His phone rang again, this time Michael Davis calling back. "The G700 is being prepared now, sir, but there's something you should know." "Go ahead." "Based on what you're describing, what you may be considering could potentially violate federal aviation regulations and might result in significant penalties or even criminal charges." James appreciated the candor. Michael was a former Air Force pilot who never sugarcoated risks. I understand the potential consequences. Michael, the question is whether you're comfortable proceeding. There was only the briefest hesitation before Michael replied. Sir, my father couldn't board flights to certain cities when he was a pilot because of the color of his skin. I'm comfortable proceeding. Thank you, Michael. Have the jet ready in 10 minutes. I'm leaving the office now. James stood, straightening his immaculate suit jacket. On his security feed, he could see Mark Sullivan still engaged in what appeared to be an increasingly uncomfortable conversation with Olivia. The gate area was growing more crowded with curious onlookers. Several had their phones out, recording the scene. As he collected his essential items and headed for the elevator, James sent one final message to Maria. Monitor all communications. If Olivia is allowed to reboard, stand down the jet but proceed with legal action. If she is prevented from boarding, execute Protocol Delta in its entirety. The elevator doors closed on James Reynolds, CEO of one of the most innovative logistics companies in the world, now fully focused on solving a different kind of logistics problem, ensuring his daughter received the justice and dignity she deserved, and that those responsible faced appropriate consequences for their actions. As the elevator descended toward the building's private garage where a car was already waiting, James felt a cold clarity settle over him. This wasn't just about one flight or one incident. This was about sending a message that would resonate throughout an industry where such discrimination had been normalized for too long. By the time the elevator reached the garage level, James had calculated exactly how to deliver that message in terms the airline industry couldn't ignore or dismiss. Airline staff realizations. Lisa Morales had been a flight attendant with Horizon Airlines for 11 years. She had worked her way up to the coveted first-class cabin position on transcontinental routes, where the tips were better and the passengers generally less demanding than in economy. She took pride in her professionalism and efficiency, in knowing the preferences of frequent flyers and anticipating needs before they were expressed. But as she arranged pre-departure beverages for the first-class passengers of Flight 892, an uncomfortable feeling had settled in her stomach. The young black girl, Olivia, had shown a valid first-class ticket. There had been no actual issue with her documentation or behavior. The only problem had been that she didn't match Pamela Whitfield's idea of who belonged in first class. And Lisa had complied. She had treated a paying passenger with a valid ticket as suspicious because another passenger had complained. The realization left a sour taste in her mouth as she poured champagne into a plastic flute, the bubbles rising and dissipating quickly, much like her professional integrity had evaporated in the face of prejudice. Is everything all right? Another flight attendant asked. Noticing Lisa's distracted expression, that girl they just removed, Lisa said quietly, glancing toward the cabin door. Her ticket was actually valid. I verified it myself before they took her off. Then why did they remove her? Lisa hesitated, the full weight of the situation finally landing. Because a white passenger complained, and we listened without questioning it. The interphone chimed, interrupting their conversation. Lisa answered, expecting a routine communication from the gate. This is Gate, Mark Sullivan's voice came through, tense and clipped. I need you to check something for me. The passenger we just deplaned, Reynolds, was there any actual issue with her ticket or behavior on board? Any disruption at all? Lisa felt her throat tighten. No, none. Her ticket was valid for first class, seat 14A. She was polite and cooperative, even when the other passenger was being hostile. There was a pause. Then Mark continued, his voice lower. The passenger's name is Reynolds, as in James Reynolds, the tech billionaire. She's his daughter. The revelation hit Lisa like a physical blow. She had participated in removing the teenage daughter of one of the most powerful businessmen in the country from a flight where she had a legitimate seat, based solely on another passenger's prejudice. Oh my God, she whispered, the potential consequences beginning to dawn on her. Exactly, Mark replied. I'm trying to resolve this before it escalates further. But you should know that she's recording everything now. And there are at least a dozen passengers at the gate doing the same. This is already on social media. As if to confirm his statement, Lisa noticed several passengers in first class looking at their phones with increased interest, some glancing toward the cabin door with expressions ranging from concern to morbid curiosity. What do we do? Lisa asked. Professional composure momentarily forgotten. I'm trying to get her back on board immediately. Mark said, but there's another problem. Ms. Whitfield is insisting that if the girl returns, she wants to be moved to a different seat away from her. We're full in first class, Lisa replied automatically. There are no other seats. I know. That's the issue. I need to know if there's any way to accommodate Ms. Whitfield elsewhere. Lisa looked around the first-class cabin. Every seat was occupied or would be once Olivia returned. The only empty seat was 14A itself. Not without downgrading her to economy, and I doubt she'd accept that, Lisa said. No, she's already made it clear she won't, Mark confirmed, frustration evident in his voice. Look, this situation is escalating quickly. Corporate is now involved. I've received 3 calls from executive offices in the last 5 minutes. Lisa's stomach dropped. In her 11 years with Horizon, she had never known corporate headquarters to intervene directly in a boarding issue unless it was extremely serious. She recalled a diversity training session from the previous year, where the instructor had warned about exactly this type of situation. Discrimination isn't just morally wrong, the trainer had emphasized. It's also bad business. One viral incident can do more damage to our brand than a year of positive PR can repair. At the time, Lisa had viewed it as just another corporate training exercise. Now she was living the case study in real time. Sir, she said, reverting to formal address as the gravity of the situation settled in. I think we need to get this passenger back on board immediately, regardless of Ms. Whitfield's preferences. The girl had a valid ticket and did nothing wrong. I know, Mark replied. And for the first time, Lisa heard real fear in her supervisor's voice. But it may already be too late. I've just been informed that Mr. Reynolds himself is personally involved and has his lawyers contacting our legal department as we speak. As Lisa absorbed this information, Pamela Whitfield signaled for her attention, holding up her empty champagne glass with an entitled expression that now seemed not just annoying but potentially catastrophic for everyone involved. I'll have to call you Max, Lisa said, suddenly seeing Pamela not as a valued first-class passenger, but as the catalyst for what was rapidly becoming a corporate crisis. As she approached with the champagne bottle, Lisa noticed that Pamela's phone screen displayed a social media feed where a post was already circulating. Black teen kicked off flight at JFK after white woman complains. Hashtag flying while black, hashtag Horizon Airlines. The post had 342 shares in just 7 minutes. Another champagne, please, Pamela said without looking up, completely oblivious to the storm she had unleashed. Lisa poured the champagne mechanically, her mind racing ahead to the potential consequences. In the highly regulated, image-conscious airline industry, incidents like this could end careers, trigger federal investigations, and cause massive reputational damage. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a more personal concern emerged. She had been complicit in discrimination against a teenage girl whose only offense was occupying a seat she had legitimately purchased. Whatever the professional consequences might be, that realization carried its own weight of shame. As she returned to the galley, Lisa's phone vibrated with a text from another flight attendant who wasn't even working this flight. Is this your plane? Attached was a link to a Twitter post that already had thousands of retweets. The image showed Olivia standing in the jet bridge, composed but clearly distressed, while Mark held her boarding pass. The caption read, "Happening now, black teenager removed from Horizon Air first class because white passenger complained. Ticket verified, valid but still forced off plane. Hashtag justice for Olivia. Hashtag Horizon racism." Lisa leaned against the galley wall, suddenly feeling lightheaded. Flight 892, scheduled to depart in just 22 minutes, had suddenly become the epicenter of a social media firestorm that was expanding with each passing second. And based on Mark's panicked tone, the most serious consequences were still to come. She thought of her own teenage daughter at home, how she would feel if someone treated her this way. The comparison made her professional failure all the more painful. This wasn't just about potentially losing her job. It was about having participated in something fundamentally wrong, something she had always believed she would stand against. The interphone chimed again. This time it was the captain. "Lisa, this is Captain Wilson. I'm hearing reports of a situation with a passenger who was removed from first class. What's going on down there?" The concern in his voice was evident. As the aircraft commander, He was ultimately responsible for everything that happened on his plane. Any significant incident would require his report and potentially testimony during investigations. Lisa took a deep breath and prepared to explain how they had collectively failed a 17-year-old girl whose only crime was being black in a space where someone like Pamela Whitfield didn't think she belonged. First signs of consequences, air traffic controller. Nathan Peterson had been managing departures from Kennedy's busy runways for the past 6 hours with the methodical precision that made him one of the tower's most respected controllers. Each aircraft movement was tracked, each communication logged, each potential conflict anticipated and prevented. Horizon 892, continue to holding point Alpha. Prepare for departure sequence, he instructed, watching the Boeing 737 begin its pushback from gate 42. His display showed the standard departure pattern, a carefully choreographed sequence designed to maximize runway usage while maintaining strict safety margins. Nothing in the morning's operations had deviated from normal parameters, until his priority channel chimed with an unexpected alert. Kennedy Tower, this is Reynolds 1 requesting immediate clearance for taxi from private aviation terminal to main departure area. Priority code Alpha 79er. Nathan frowned, the fluorescent lights of the tower reflecting off his glasses as he leaned forward to check his secondary display. The call sign wasn't familiar, and priority code Alpha 79er indicated an emergency medical transport, typically reserved for organ transportation or critical patient transfers. Yet the request had come from the private aviation terminal, not a medical facility. Reynolds 1 to verify nature of medical emergency, Nathan responded, already consulting his secondary display for information on the aircraft. Tower, Reynolds 1, G700 business jet, no medical emergency. Priority relates to Reynolds Quantum Systems corporate security protocol. Request direct clearance to holding position near runway 31. Nathan's frown deepened, creating fine lines at the corners of his eyes that betrayed his 20 years in air traffic control. Priority codes were not meant for corporate convenience, regardless of a company's size or influence. He was about to deny the request when his supervisor's line lit up. Nathan, this is Supervisor Thompson. The Reynolds 1 request has been verified at the highest level. Expedite their movement to runway 31L vicinity. Sir, they're using a medical priority code inappropriately, and they're requesting positioning near an active departure runway without a filed flight plan. Through the tower's panoramic windows, Nathan could see the sleek silhouette of the G700 beginning to move from its hangar, its polished exterior gleaming in the morning sun. The aircraft represented the pinnacle of private aviation, a $65 million flying office with a range capable of crossing oceans and a cabin appointed with luxury beyond most first-class commercial experiences. The authorization comes directly from Director Alvarez, Thompson replied, naming the airport's operations director. And before you ask, yes, she's aware it's irregular. Proceed as instructed. Nathan hesitated only briefly. Victoria Alvarez wasn't known for bending regulations without serious cause. If she had authorized this, there must be extraordinary circumstances involved. Understood, he finally replied, then switched back to his main channel. Reynolds 1, or PU, you are cleared for priority taxi via taxiways Echo. Bravo, to holding position, Bravo 3 near runway 31L. Proceed with caution. Remain on this frequency. Roger, Tower. Reynolds 1 proceeding as instructed. Nathan watched his radar display as the private jet began to move from its hangar toward the main taxiways. Simultaneously, Horizon 892 continued its standard departure sequence. The pilots, completely unaware of the unusual activity involving a private jet moving toward their assigned departure runway. The radio chatter continued around him, a dozen other aircraft requesting clearances, position updates, and departure instructions. Nathan handled each with practiced efficiency, but part of his attention remained fixed on the unusual movement of Reynolds 1. What's the story with that G700? Asked another controller, noticing the priority routing. Director's authorization, Nathan replied, keeping his tone neutral. Corporate security protocol. In the airport's operational control center, Victoria Alvarez was dealing with an unprecedented situation. On one screen, she monitored the movement of Reynolds 1. Again, the G700 private jet registered to Reynolds Quantum Systems. On another, she reviewed the rapidly multiplying incident reports regarding the situation at Gate 42. Her secure line rang, the third call in as many minutes from Horizon Airlines corporate headquarters. Director Alvarez, this is Graham Mitchell, Chief Operations Officer for Horizon. We have a situation developing with Flight 892 that may require your intervention. I'm already aware. Mr. Mitchell, Victoria replied calmly, her fingers tapping a quiet rhythm on her desk. My understanding is that a passenger with a valid ticket was removed from your aircraft based on another passenger's complaint, and this has resulted in Mr. Reynolds taking certain actions. That's an accurate summary, Mitchell admitted, sounding surprised by her knowledge. We're working to resolve the situation immediately. The passenger, Ms. Reynolds, is being reaccommodated on the flight as we speak. I see. And are you aware that Mr. Reynolds' private jet is currently taxiing toward the departure runway assigned to Flight 892? The silence that followed was telling. What? On what authority? On my authority, Victoria stated flatly. Mr. Reynolds contacted my office directly with evidence of discriminatory treatment of his daughter by your airline staff. Given the sensitivity and potential security implications, I authorized the movement of his aircraft while we assess the situation. This wasn't entirely true. James Reynolds had leveraged his company's service contracts with the airport to gain direct access to Victoria, bypassing normal channels. But the essence was accurate. Victoria had made a calculated decision that managing this situation proactively was preferable to allowing it to escalate further. Director Alvarez, Mitchell's voice had taken on a note of panic. I assure you we're handling this internally. There's no need for Mr. Reynolds to involve his private aircraft. If you could instruct the tower to deny his movement— Mr. Mitchell, Victoria interrupted. Let me be clear. Mr. Reynolds has provided documentation showing that his minor daughter was removed from your aircraft after her ticket was verified as valid, solely because another passenger objected to her presence. This raises serious civil rights concerns that fall under federal transportation regulations. I've made an operational decision to monitor this situation closely, which includes allowing Mr. Reynolds appropriate access to airport facilities. But he can't just— I suggest you focus on resolving the situation with Ms. Reynolds immediately, Victoria continued. If she is properly reaccommodated and departs on Flight 892 without further incident, I imagine Mr. Reynolds will stand down his aircraft. If not, well, that becomes a different scenario entirely. As she ended the call, Victoria checked the time, 10:48 a.m. Flight 892 was scheduled to depart at 11 o'clock a.m., just 12 minutes from now. Reynolds 1 was already halfway to its designated holding position near runway 31. On her main display, a social media monitoring alert showed that videos of Olivia Reynolds' removal from the aircraft were spreading rapidly across multiple platforms. Hashtag Horizon Airlines and hashtag Flying While Black were trending nationwide. Media inquiries were beginning to flood the airport's public relations office. The next few minutes would determine whether this situation de-escalated into a routine incident report or exploded into something that would make national headlines and trigger federal investigations. Victoria had seen enough in her years managing airport operations to recognize the signs of an impending crisis: the rapid escalation, the involvement of a high-profile individual, the social media attention already building, all pointed to a situation with potential to disrupt far more than just one flight's departure schedule. She picked up her secure line again, this time calling the airport's legal department. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, Kennedy International Airport needed to be positioned to demonstrate that its own protocols had been followed correctly, even if Horizon Airlines had failed in its responsibilities. As she waited for the call to connect, Victoria watched Reynolds 1 continue its deliberate progress toward runway 31. The private jet wasn't speeding, wasn't violating any movement protocols, but its very presence near the commercial departure runway represented an unspoken threat that everyone involved understood perfectly. James Reynolds was positioning his resources to ensure his daughter received justice, one way or another. Part 4, the confrontation. James Reynolds sat in the plush leather seat of his Gulfstream G700 phone pressed to his ear as he monitored his daughter's situation. Through the aircraft's window, he could see the massive form of Horizon Flight 892 in the distance, still positioned at the gate but with its jet bridge now detached, indicating imminent departure. The private cabin smelled of fine leather and subtle cologne, a stark contrast to the recycled air and cramped quarters of commercial aviation. The polished wood surfaces gleamed under soft ambient lighting designed to reduce eye strain. It was a space engineered for comfort and efficiency, two qualities conspicuously absent from his daughter's current experience. "They're not letting me back on, Dad." Olivia's voice carried a mixture of disbelief and resignation. "They're saying the flight is in final departure sequence, and they can't reboard passengers." "Are they offering alternatives?" James asked, though he already knew what the answer would be. "They said they can put me on the next flight to Boston at 3 a.m. I'd missed the entire first day of the program." Her voice caught slightly on the last few words. James checked his watch, 10:52 a.m. He had hoped it wouldn't come to this, had given Horizon Airlines every opportunity to correct their error. They had failed. "Michael," he addressed his pilot, "proceed with Phase 2. Michael Davis nodded, his expression professionally neutral, despite the extraordinary nature of their mission. He keyed his radio. "Kennedy Tower. This is Reynolds 1 requesting permission to cross runway 31L to reach private aviation maintenance area on opposite side." The request was deliberately misleading. There was no maintenance requirement, and they had no intention of simply crossing the runway. But it established a legitimate-sounding reason for positioning the aircraft exactly where James wanted it. Nathan Peterson's voice came through the radio, sounding increasingly wary. "Reynolds 1, hold position at current location. We have departing traffic preparing for takeoff on 31L. Tower, be advised we have time-sensitive maintenance requirements and need to cross within the next 5 minutes." Michael responded, following the script James had outlined. While this exchange continued, James spoke again to Olivia. "Listen carefully. In about 3 minutes, things are going to change dramatically. I need you to remain exactly where you are. Continue recording everything, and wait for my next instructions." "Dad, what are you, Trust me, Olivia, just stay where you are." As he ended the call, James could see through his window that Horizon 892 had begun to push back from the gate. The timing would need to be perfect. In the control tower, Nathan Peterson was growing increasingly suspicious of Reynolds 1's requests. The private jet had now reached holding position Bravo 3, directly adjacent to the departure end of runway 31L, the exact runway where Horizon 892 would take off in less than 8 minutes. "Reynolds 1, I'm showing no filed maintenance requirement for your aircraft. Please clarify the nature of your requests to cross active departure runway." Before Michael could respond, Nathan's supervisor line lit up again. "Nathan, you need to be aware that we have a developing situation with Reynolds 1 and Horizon 892, Thompson said, his voice tense. "Director Alvarez is monitoring personally. Treat all communications with Reynolds 1 as priority, but do not authorize runway crossing until further notice." "Sir, what exactly is going on?" Nathan asked, growing increasingly uncomfortable with the irregular procedures. "Civil rights incident on Horizon 892. Reynolds 1 belongs to the father of a passenger who was allegedly removed from the flight inappropriately. Reynolds is making a point." Nathan's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Is he threatening to block the runway?" "Not explicitly, but we're treating this as a potential nonviolent protest situation. Director Alvarez is communicating directly with Horizon executive leadership to resolve before it escalates further." On the ground, James watched as Horizon 892 began to push back from the gate. His timing would need to be perfect. "Michael, execute now," he instructed. Without hesitation, Michael keyed the radio again. "Kennedy Tower, Reynolds 1 declaring an immediate stop for mechanical inspection. We have observed potential landing gear irregularity and need to inspect before any further movement." The controller's response was immediate and alarmed. "Reynolds 1, confirm your position is secure and away from active runway. Tower, Reynolds 1 is currently positioned at the threshold of runway 31. We are unable to move until inspection is complete due to safety concerns." The carefully worded response conveyed the reality. The G700 was now effectively blocking the departure runway for Horizon 892. It wasn't physically on the runway, but it was positioned in a way that no commercial pilot would attempt to take off with the private jet so close to the threshold. Through his window, James could see the Boeing 737 halt its pushback as the ground crew likely received updated instructions. The chess move had been executed perfectly. Horizon 892 was now immobilized without James having to explicitly violate any aviation regulations. "Reynolds 1, you are instructed to clear the runway approach immediately if able." Nathan's voice had taken on a new urgency. Negative. Tower. Safety protocol requires full inspection before movement. Estimate 45 minutes to complete. We have deployed inspection team. This last statement was completely false. No one had exited the aircraft, but it created the necessary justification for the extended blockage. James's phone rang. It was Eleanor Williams, his chief legal counsel. We're monitoring the situation, she said without preamble. Just to be clear, you've positioned your aircraft to prevent Horizon 892 from departing. I've positioned my aircraft for necessary safety inspections in the only available location. James replied carefully. If that happens to prevent a flight that discriminated against my daughter from departing, that's an unfortunate coincidence. Eleanor's sigh carried a mixture of exasperation and grudging admiration. The FAA will see through that pretext immediately. You're looking at a substantial loss and possible license suspension for your pilot. I'm aware, all consequences will be my responsibility, not Michael's. His job and compensation are guaranteed regardless of outcome. And what exactly is your end game here? James beyond making a statement. James watched through his window as airport operations vehicles began to gather nearby, their yellow lights flashing against the gray tarmac. My daughter will be on that flight in her assigned seat, or that plane isn't going anywhere. It's that simple. Nothing with you is ever that simple, Eleanor replied. What you're really doing is forcing an industry-wide reckoning by making discrimination expensive enough that prevention becomes the rational choice. James smiled slightly. It was why he valued Eleanor. She always understood the systemic implications of his actions. Precisely. Now, I believe my phone is about to ring again with someone from Horizon's executive team. Let's see if they've done the math yet on how much this delay is costing them per minute. In the operations center, Victoria Alvarez watched the unfolding situation with a mixture of professional concern and reluctant admiration for the elegance of Reynolds' maneuver. He had effectively grounded Flight 892 without explicitly violating any regulations severely enough to trigger immediate security intervention. Her direct line to Horizon's executive offices rang again. Director Alvarez, this is unacceptable. Mitchell practically shouted, Reynolds is deliberately blocking our departure runway. This is a federal violation. Mr. Mitchell, Victoria replied calmly. My understanding is that Reynolds 1 has declared a safety inspection due to observed landing gear irregularities. This is a standard safety protocol. That's obviously a pretext he's blocking our flight because of the situation with his daughter. Perhaps, Victoria acknowledged. Which brings me back to my earlier question. Has your airline resolved the situation with Ms. Reynolds yet? The silence that followed was telling. The flight is in departure sequence. We can't reboard passengers at this stage. We've offered her a seat on the next flight to Boston. I see, Victoria said. And have you considered that this entire situation, including the current runway blockage affecting not just Flight 892, but potentially dozens of subsequent departures, could have been avoided if your staff had simply allowed a passenger with a verified valid ticket to remain in her assigned seat? This is extortion, Mitchell protested. He's holding an entire flight hostage. No, Mr. Mitchell. From my perspective, it appears that one of the world's foremost logistics experts is providing your airline with an extremely costly lesson in the consequences of discriminatory treatment. Now, I suggest you reconsider your position on reboarding Ms. Reynolds immediately, because I can assure you that Mr. Reynolds is fully prepared to maintain his aircraft's safety inspection until his daughter is properly accommodated. As she ended the call, Victoria checked the operational impact display. 17 flights were now affected by the runway closure, with cascading delays that would soon impact arrivals as well. The estimated cost to airlines was already approaching $250,000 and climbing with each passing minute. It was an extraordinarily expensive lesson in the consequences of discrimination, precisely as James Reynolds had intended. On board Reynolds 1, James received the call he had been expecting. Mr. Reynolds, this is Graham Mitchell, Chief Operations Officer for Horizon Airlines. The forced pleasantness in his voice couldn't mask the panic beneath. Mr. Mitchell, I understand you're having some operational difficulties this morning. Mr. Reynolds, I want to personally assure you that we take the situation with your daughter very seriously. We're investigating what happened and save the corporate script, James interrupted calmly. My daughter had a valid first-class ticket. She was removed from your aircraft solely because another passenger objected to her presence based on racial bias. Your staff verified her ticket was valid, but removed her anyway. Those are the facts. I understand your frustration, but I'm not frustrated. Mr. Mitchell, I'm resolute. My daughter will be on that flight, in her assigned seat, or that plane isn't going anywhere today. It's a simple equation. There was a brief silence as Mitchell processed the unambiguous ultimatum. Mr. Reynolds, surely we can reach a reasonable accommodation here. We've offered Ms. Reynolds a seat on our next flight to Boston with a complimentary upgrade, and that's not acceptable, James replied. She had a valid ticket for flight 892. She was removed without cause. She will be reaccommodated on flight 892, or I guarantee you that flight will not depart today. You can't just, I already have, James stated simply. Now, let me outline what happens next. 1. My daughter is returned to her assigned seat immediately. 2. The passenger who instigated this incident is removed from the flight for violating your non-discrimination policies. 3. You issue a public apology, acknowledging that this was a clear case of discrimination. 4. You implement comprehensive bias training for all customer-facing staff. 5. You make a $10 million donation to the National Coalition for Aviation Diversity. The demands were delivered not as a negotiation, but as a simple statement of fact, the price of resolving the current situation. That's extortion, Mitchell sputtered. No, Mr. Mitchell, it's consequence. You operate in a regulated industry where discrimination is expressly prohibited. You violated those regulations. I'm simply ensuring the penalty is proportional to the offense. And if we refuse, then my aircraft continues its safety inspection. Your flight doesn't depart. The videos of my daughter's mistreatment continue circulating on social media. And by market open tomorrow, your stock price reflects the public's response to how Horizon Airlines treats its passengers. As James spoke, his phone buzzed with a message from Eleanor. Horizon legal team requesting conference call in 5 minutes. They're capitulating. At gate 42, Olivia stood surrounded by a growing crowd of curious passengers and airport staff, all watching the unfolding drama. Several had their phones out, recording the scene. Mark Sullivan was on his phone, his face growing increasingly pale as he received new information. But that's impossible, he stammered. He can't just... How did he... As Mark ended his call, he turned to Olivia with an entirely different expression than before, something between fear and desperate appeasement. Ms. Reynolds, he said, his voice strained with forced politeness, we've reconsidered your situation. We would like to escort you back to your seat on flight 892 immediately. Olivia, still recording as her father had instructed, maintained her composure despite the whirlwind of emotions. I thought the flight was in final departure sequence and couldn't accept additional passengers, she asked, her tone neutral but pointed. We've made an exception in your case, Mark replied, not quite meeting her eyes. If you'll follow me, please. As they moved toward the jet bridge, Olivia's phone buzzed with a text from her father. Remember, document everything. This isn't just about your seat anymore. It's about ensuring this doesn't happen to someone else who might not have the resources we do. The message reminded Olivia that her father's dramatic intervention wasn't just about getting her to Boston on time. It was about leveraging their privileged position to force accountability in a system that routinely allowed discrimination to go unchallenged. As she followed Mark back toward the plane, Olivia was acutely aware of the dozens of eyes on her, some sympathetic, others curious, a few resentful. But for the first time since Pamela Whitfield had first challenged her presence, Olivia felt something beyond humiliation and anger. She felt powerful. Chaos at the airport director Victoria Alvarez's typically orderly operations center had transformed into a crisis management hub. 6 different screens displayed various aspects of the unfolding situation: the position of Reynolds 1 near runway 31L, the halted Horizon 892 on the taxiway, social media feeds exploding with updates and video clips, news outlets beginning to pick up the story, and a rapidly growing backlog of flights affected by the runway blockage. The room hummed with the urgent voices of staff trying to manage the cascading disruptions. The air seemed thicker, charged with tension as professionals accustomed to solving operational problems confronted an unprecedented situation that blended technical, social, and ethical dimensions. "How many departures are now delayed?" Victoria asked her deputy, not taking her eyes off the main display. 17 and counting, he replied grimly. "If this continues beyond 20 minutes, we'll have to implement flow control, which will affect arrivals as well." Victoria nodded, processing the cascading consequences. Each minute of runway blockage created approximately $15,000 in direct operational costs to the airlines, not counting passenger compensation, crew timing issues, and connection disruptions. Reynolds' safety inspection was already approaching a seven-figure impact. Her secure line rang again, this time from Airport Security Chief Rafael Mendez. "Victoria, we need direction," Rafael said without preamble. "Do we treat this as a security incident requiring intervention, or as a mechanical issue, as they're claiming?" It was the question Victoria had been wrestling with since Reynolds 1 had first positioned itself near the runway. Technically, James Reynolds wasn't violating any regulations severely enough to justify forcible removal. He had declared a safety inspection, which was his right as the aircraft's owner. Disproving that claim would require bringing in FAA inspectors, which would take hours, exactly as Reynolds had undoubtedly calculated. "For now, we classify it as a mechanical issue," Victoria decided, "but position response teams discreetly nearby. If this extends beyond resolving the immediate situation with Ms. Reynolds, we'll reassess." "Understood," Raphael replied. "Just so you're aware, we're getting media inquiries already. Someone on the Horizon flight has been live streaming the whole incident, including the daughter being escorted back to the plane. It's trending on multiple platforms." Victoria wasn't surprised. In today's connected environment, incidents like this couldn't be contained. The only question was how the various entities involved, the airport, Horizon Airlines, and Reynolds himself, would be perceived in the court of public opinion. "I'm watching the feeds," she confirmed. "This has already gone beyond an operational incident. It's a full-blown PR crisis for Horizon, and potentially for us if we don't handle it correctly." "Should we prepare a statement?" Raphael asked. "Yes, but carefully. Emphasize our role in ensuring safety and facilitating resolution. We're neutral parties ensuring operational integrity, not taking sides in the underlying dispute." As she ended the call, Victoria studied the social media metrics displayed on one of her monitors. The hashtags #Horizon Racism and #JamesReynoldsBlocked had achieved viral status within the last 30 minutes. Video clips from inside the terminal and aircraft were being shared thousands of times per minute. One clip in particular had gained extraordinary traction. Footage showing Olivia being escorted off the plane while Pamela Whitfield watched with visible satisfaction. The caption read, "Happening now. Black teenager kicked off Horizon Air for being in first class with valid ticket. White woman complains she didn't belong there and they removed her. #FlyingWhileBlack." The video had already been viewed over 2 million times. Across the airport, the ripple effects were rapidly expanding. Passengers scheduled on the growing list of delayed flights were receiving notifications on their phones, creating lines at customer service counters. Gate agents were fielding increasingly angry questions they couldn't answer. Flight crews were calculating how delays would impact their legally mandated duty time limits. In the main terminal food court, dozens of travelers were gathered around the television monitors that typically showed CNN on mute. But now the screens displayed breaking news banners. Tech billionaire blocks runway after daughter removed from flight, and racial profiling incident at JFK creates travel chaos. People clustered around the screens, many filming the coverage with their phones to share on social media, creating a recursive loop of digital amplification that expanded the story's reach exponentially with each passing minute. Airport operations manager Gregory Hansen was on the phone with his counterparts at Boston Logan, trying to manage the downstream effects. "We have at least a dozen flights delayed so far, with potential cancellations if this drags on," he explained, rubbing his temples as a stress headache built behind his eyes. "You'll start seeing the impact within the hour." The interconnected nature of the aviation system meant that a blockage at Kennedy would soon affect airports across the country. Planes that couldn't depart from JFK wouldn't be available for their subsequent routes from Boston, Chicago, Atlanta, and beyond. Crew scheduling would be disrupted. potentially triggering cancellations even after the immediate issue was resolved. Meanwhile, at Gate 42, a crowd had gathered to watch as Olivia Reynolds was escorted back to Flight 892. The scene had taken on an almost ceremonial quality, with Mark Sullivan walking slightly ahead, his body language now deferential where it had been dismissive earlier. "Is it true her dad blocked the runway with his private jet?" a passenger asked loudly. "My brother works ground crew. He says there is a G700 parked right at the departure end, and it belongs to James Reynolds," another replied. "Who's James Reynolds?" a third passenger questioned. "Only one of the richest men in tech, Reynolds Quantum Systems, worth billions." Wait, so he literally parked his private jet in front of a commercial airliner because they discriminated against his daughter. That's some serious dad energy right there. The commentary followed Olivia as she walked, head held high, back toward the jet bridge. Her phone was still recording, capturing every moment of this extraordinary reversal. On the tarmac, ground crew members watched the unfolding drama with professional interest tinged with admiration for Reynolds' audacity. Most had experienced or witnessed instances of passenger mistreatment, particularly of minorities, but had never seen such a dramatic response. Man literally parked his jet in front of a commercial airliner. One ground handler said to another, "That's some next-level dad move right there." "You know what the best part is?" his colleague replied. "He's not even technically breaking any rules. Safety inspection is a legit reason to hold position. Can't prove he doesn't actually need one." In the air traffic control tower, Nathan Peterson was coordinating the complex rerouting of scheduled departures to Kennedy's other runways, a task complicated by existing traffic patterns and weather considerations. American 1477 expect further delay of approximately 15 minutes. "We're working to clear the situation," he informed yet another pilot whose departure was affected by the blockage. The responses from flight crews had evolved from initial confusion to understanding as word of the situation spread through aviation channels. Several pilots had expressed veiled support for Reynolds' action, having witnessed similar discriminatory treatment of passengers over their careers. "Tower, American 1477, one captain responded. "Understand the delay. Just to clarify, is this the Horizon discrimination situation we're hearing about?" "Affirm, American 1477, Nathan replied, keeping his voice professionally neutral despite the unusual nature of the exchange. "We're working to resolve and resume normal operations." "Roger that, Tower. We can hold as needed. Some things are worth the wait." In the private aviation terminal, Reynolds Quantum Systems Aviation Department had implemented their own response protocols. 3 additional corporate jets were being prepared for potential deployment, a contingency plan in case authorities attempted to forcibly move the G700 from its position. James Reynolds was making it clear that he had the resources and determination to maintain this standoff as long as necessary. Back in the operations center, Victoria Alvarez received confirmation that Olivia Reynolds was being re-escorted to the aircraft. She immediately called her counterpart at Horizon Airlines. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm informed that Ms. Reynolds is now being returned to her original seat. Can you confirm?" "Yes," Mitchell replied tersely. "She's boarding now. Will Reynolds clear the runway once she's seated?" "That's my understanding," Victoria said. "Though I imagine that there will be follow-up regarding how this situation was handled." "This is extortion," Mitchell repeated his earlier accusation. "No, Mr. Mitchell, this is consequence," Victoria corrected. "Your staff removed a passenger with a valid ticket based on another passenger's prejudice. Mr. Reynolds simply ensured that action had a cost significant enough to be remembered." As she ended the call, Victoria watched the cascading alerts on her system, 23 departures now delayed, estimated costs approaching $1.2 million, media coverage expanding to all major networks. What had begun as a single act of discrimination at Gate 42 had transformed into an incident that would be studied in crisis management courses for years to come. And at the center of it all, a 17-year-old girl whose journey to a summer program had become a powerful demonstration of both the persistent reality of racial prejudice and the extraordinary lengths to which a father would go to protect his daughter's dignity. Horizon Airlines realization. In Horizon Airlines Regional Operations Center, located in a nondescript office building near the airport, Regional Director Stephanie Winston was watching her carefully structured career implode in real time. The sterile conference room had transformed into a war room, with laptops open to various monitoring systems. phones constantly buzzing with updates, and the grim faces of executives who recognized that they were facing not just an operational disruption, but an existential threat to the company's reputation. The stock is down 8% already. Thomas Garcia, the PR manager, reported grimly, looking up from his tablet. Trading volume is 10 times normal. The market opened just an hour ago. Stephanie nodded numbly, her eyes fixed on the multiple crisis feeds displayed on the wall monitors. One showed the flight-aware map with a growing constellation of delayed flights. Another displayed the rapid-fire social media response, with the hashtag Horizon Racism trending nationwide. A third showed news coverage, where commentators were already speculating about the long-term damage to the airline's reputation. "How did we get here?" she asked, the question rhetorical but revealing the shock still reverberating through the corporate response team. The answer was painfully clear to everyone in the room. A first-class passenger, Pamela Whitfield, had complained about the presence of a young black woman in the cabin. Instead of recognizing and rejecting the prejudice underlying the complaint, Horizon staff had accommodated it, removing Olivia Reynolds from the flight despite her valid ticket. In doing so, they had unwittingly targeted the daughter of James Reynolds, a man with both the resources and the resolve to demand accountability in the most dramatic fashion possible. "We have confirmation that Ms. Reynolds is back on board," an operations coordinator reported. "Seated in her original seat, 14A. "And Reynolds 1, Stephanie asked. "Still in position near the runway. They're maintaining the safety inspection status." Stephanie turned to Thomas. "Draft an immediate communication to Miss Reynolds. Confirm his daughter's reaccommodation and request clearance of the runway." As Thomas began typing, another alert appeared on the main screen, a notification from corporate headquarters in Dallas. "Director Winston, please join emergency executive conference immediately." The message was followed by a conference line number that Stephanie recognized as the CEO's personal crisis channel, one that was activated only for the most severe situations threatening the company's operation or reputation. With a sense of foreboding, Stephanie connected to the call, placing it on speaker so her team could hear. "This is Winston," she announced. "Stephanie, this is Richard Harper." The CEO's voice filled the room. "I'm here with legal, operations, and our board chairman. What the hell is happening at Kennedy?" The bluntness of the question reflected the severity of the situation. Stephanie took a deep breath and provided a concise summary of the events, concluding with the current status. "So, to be absolutely clear," Richard said when she finished, "our staff removed a passenger with a valid first-class ticket because another passenger didn't think she looked like she belonged there. And this passenger happened to be the daughter of James Reynolds, who is now blocking our aircraft from departing with his private jet." "That's accurate, sir," Stephanie confirmed, the words painful to speak aloud. There was a long silence before Richard spoke again, his voice now carefully controlled. "We have just received a communication from Reynolds' legal team. They are prepared to file federal civil rights charges, FAA complaints for discriminatory treatment, and a civil lawsuit for emotional distress and defamation unless we meet certain non-negotiable conditions." "What conditions?" Stephanie asked, though she already suspected the answer wouldn't be simply financial. "First, immediate termination of all staff involved in the decision to remove Mrs. Reynolds from the flight. Second, a public apology acknowledging the discriminatory nature of the incident. Third, implementation of a comprehensive anti-bias training program to be developed with input from civil rights organizations. Fourth, a $10 million donation to the National Coalition for Aviation Diversity." The demands were sweeping but not unreasonable given the circumstances. What surprised Stephanie was the absence of a personal financial settlement, a clear indication that this wasn't about money for Reynolds but about forcing systemic change. "And if we don't agree," she asked, "then Mr. Reynolds has made it clear his jet will remain exactly where it is, continuing its safety inspection indefinitely. Meanwhile, his media team will provide all documentation and recordings of the incident to every major news outlet, and their legal filing is already prepared." Another voice joined the call, Jennifer Reeves from the legal department. "I've reviewed the preliminary evidence they provided. It's damning, frankly. Multiple recordings from different angles, clear documentation of our staff's actions, and metadata proving the sequence of events. If this goes to court, we lose, and lose badly." The implication was clear. Fighting Reynolds would not only extend the current operational crisis, but would likely result in an even more costly legal defeat and public relations disaster. Sir, Stephanie said, I recommend we accept all conditions immediately. The longer this continues, the greater the damage to our operations and reputation. Agreed, Richard replied without hesitation. Thomas, is your team prepared for immediate crisis communications? Thomas leaned toward the speakerphone. Yes, sir. We have draft statements ready for release as soon as we receive your approval. Good. Priority 1 is getting that runway cleared. Coordinate with airport operations to confirm when Reynolds 1 moves, then implement the full crisis response protocol. As the call continued, Stephanie glanced at her phone to find dozens of messages from industry colleagues. News of the incident had spread throughout the aviation community, with many expressing private support for Reynolds' actions. Several messages were from former colleagues who had witnessed similar incidents, but lacked the power to force accountability. On the main display, a new video was trending, footage from inside Flight 892 showing Olivia Reynolds returning to her seat in first class. The camera panned to show Pamela Whitfield's face, now frozen in a mixture of shock and indignation as she realized the tables had turned. The caption read, "When you try to get someone kicked off a plane, but their dad owns a private jet, #JusticeTakesFlight, #HorizonFail." The video had already been viewed over 300,000 times in less than 10 minutes. We need to address Ms. Whitfield as well, Stephanie said, interrupting the ongoing discussion. She's the passenger who initiated this situation. What do you propose? Richard asked. We remove her from the flight instead, Stephanie replied firmly. She demonstrated discriminatory behavior toward another passenger. That violates our code of conduct. There was a momentary silence as the executive team processed this suggestion. It creates a clear contrast, Dr. Thomas added, seeing the PR value though. It demonstrates we're serious about correcting our mistake and sends a message about our values going forward. Do it, Richard decided, but handle it carefully. Record everything. Follow all protocols precisely. We don't need another incident. As the call continued, Stephanie dispatched instructions to the gate team at Kennedy. The wheel of consequences had turned, and Pamela Whitfield was about to discover what it meant to be on the receiving end of the very system she had tried to use against Olivia Reynolds. Outside the conference room window, Stephanie could see aircraft taking off and landing at the nearby airport, each representing hundreds of lives temporarily entrusted to Horizon Airlines' care. The company's failure to honor that trust for one young woman had cascaded into a crisis that would define its reputation for years to come. The lesson was as expensive as it was necessary. The ultimatum. On board Flight 892, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin was charged with tension. Olivia Reynolds had been re-escorted to her seat at 14A, where she sat with perfect composure, her phone still recording. Around her, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin carried a subtle undercurrent of awareness, as if the space itself had been transformed by the confrontation and its resolution. The soft hum of the aircraft's systems seemed unusually loud in the strained silence. The normally bustling pre-departure activity had slowed to a cautious minimum. Flight attendants moving through the cabin with careful efficiency, avoiding unnecessary interaction. Pamela Whitfield sat rigidly in her aisle seat, deliberately avoiding eye contact with Olivia while tapping furiously on her phone. The smug satisfaction she had displayed earlier had been replaced by a growing awareness that she had miscalculated severely. Captain Robert Wilson's voice came over the intercom, carefully neutral, but unable to completely hide his frustration. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're currently experiencing a slight delay in our departure sequence. We appreciate your patience and will provide updates as they become available. The deliberate vagueness of the announcement prompted murmurs throughout the cabin. Many passengers were already aware of the actual situation thanks to social media and messages from friends or family elsewhere in the airport. Is it true there's a private jet blocking our runway? A businessman asked a passing flight attendant. The flight attendant offered a professional non-answer. We're working with air traffic control to resolve a scheduling issue. We should be moving shortly. But the increasingly restless passengers knew better. Links to live news coverage were being shared, and some had friends in the terminal sending real-time updates about the growing media presence at the gate. In first class, the tension reached a breaking point when Carlos Rodriguez, the Hispanic passenger who had attempted to intervene earlier, spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. So we're all just gunning to pretend we didn't witness a young woman being removed from this flight because of how she looks, and now we're delayed because her father had to force the airline to do the right thing. His words hung in the air, challenging the collective silence that had allowed the discrimination to occur in the first place. Before anyone could respond, Mark Sullivan reappeared at the front of the cabin, accompanied by two other Horizon staff members. Their expressions were grim as they approached row 14. "Ms. Whitfield," Mark said, his voice carefully controlled but audible to nearby passengers. "I need you to gather your belongings and come with me. Please." Pamela looked up in shock, her fingers freezing over her phone screen. "Excuse me, you're being removed from this flight," Mark continued. "Your behavior toward another passenger violated our code of conduct regarding discriminatory actions." "This is outrageous," Pamela sputtered, her voice rising as color flooded her cheeks. "You can't just—" "Ma'am," Mark interrupted. "This is not a request. Your actions initiated a situation that has now affected hundreds of passengers and caused significant operational disruption. We need you to deplane immediately." The reversal was as dramatic as it was unexpected. Around the cabin, passengers watched with varying reactions, some visibly satisfied by the turn of events, others uncomfortable with the public nature of the confrontation regardless of its justification. Pamela turned to Olivia, her expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. "This is your doing. You've manipulated this situation entirely." Olivia met her gaze steadily. "I simply occupied the seat I purchased. Everything that followed was the result of your assumptions about where I belong." The simple dignity of the response seemed to deflate Pamela's outrage. Reality was settling in. She had created this situation through her own prejudice, and now she was facing consequences proportional to her actions. "This will not stand," she muttered, gathering her belongings with trembling hands. "I've been flying first class for 15 years. My company has a corporate account with this airline. We'll be happy to discuss your future travel arrangements at the gate," Mark replied professionally. "For now, we need to prepare the aircraft for departure." As Pamela was escorted off the plane, the cabin remained unusually quiet. The symbolic weight of the moment was lost on no one. Justice had been served, if belatedly and only after extraordinary intervention. Outside the aircraft, James Reynolds remained in communication with both his daughter and the various stakeholders involved in resolving the situation. From his position on the G700, he could see Flight 892 still waiting on the taxiway, unable to proceed while his jet remained near the runway threshold. His phone chimed with a message from his legal team. "Horizon has accepted all conditions, awaiting confirmation of Whitfield's removal before clearing runway." James nodded with satisfaction. The airline's quick capitulation confirmed what he had suspected. They knew they were completely in the wrong and were now focused on damage control rather than defending the indefensible. In the air traffic control tower, Nathan Peterson received the update he'd been waiting for. "Tower, Reynolds 1, safety inspection completed satisfactorily. Request permission to return to private aviation terminal." Nathan allowed himself a small smile at the transparent pretext. "Reynolds 1, you are cleared to taxi via taxiways Bravo and Echo back to private aviation terminal. Proceed when ready." "Tower, Reynolds 1 proceeding as instructed. Thank you for your cooperation during our safety procedures." The professional courtesy in the exchange belied the extraordinary nature of what had just transpired. A private citizen had effectively held an entire airport hostage to ensure his daughter was treated with the dignity she deserved. As the G700 began to move away from the runway threshold, Nathan immediately updated the departure sequence. "Horizon 892. Runway is now clear. You are number 1 for departure. Proceed to holding point runway 31L." In the operations center, Victoria Alvarez watched as the situation began to resolve. The cascade of delays would continue for hours, affecting dozens of flights and thousands of passengers. The cost to Horizon Airlines would be measured not just in immediate operational expenses, but in long-term reputational damage and the concrete changes they had agreed to implement. Yet there was a certain satisfaction in witnessing accountability being enforced so decisively. Too often, incidents like this were addressed with empty apologies and meaningless gestures. James Reynolds had ensured that this time, the consequences would be proportional to the offense. On board Flight 892, Captain Wilson's voice came over the intercom again, this time with unmistakable relief. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared for departure and will be on our way to Boston shortly. We appreciate your patience during this delay. As the aircraft began to move toward the runway, Olivia finally stopped recording and sent the complete documentation to her father as he had instructed. The video would serve as evidence for the legal actions to follow, ensuring that the agreements made under pressure would be honored long after the immediate crisis had passed. Carlos Rodriguez, seated a few rows ahead, turned back to catch Olivia's eye. He gave her a subtle nod of respect, an acknowledgement of her dignity throughout the ordeal, and recognition of the broader significance of what had just occurred. Olivia returned the nod, allowing herself a small smile of vindication. What had begun as a humiliating experience had transformed into a powerful demonstration that prejudice could no longer operate without consequence in spaces that had long tolerated it. As Flight 892 accelerated down runway 31L, finally beginning its journey to Boston, James Reynolds watched from his G700, now taxiing back to the private aviation terminal. The incident would cost him a substantial fine for interfering with the airport operations, possible suspension of his pilot's aviation privileges, and likely other regulatory consequences. But watching his daughter finally heading toward the opportunity she had earned through her own merit, James considered it the best investment he had made in years. Part 5, Resolution and Immediate Aftermath. The scene on Flight 892 as Olivia Reynolds returned to her seat was a study in contrasts. Where before she had been subjected to suspicious glances and outright hostility, now she was met with a mixture of awestruck stares and embarrassed avoidance of eye contact. The soft hiss of the cabin air system and the muted conversations created a backdrop of tension as she walked down the aisle, every eye tracking her movement. The same path she had taken in humiliation just minutes earlier now felt like a victory march, though Olivia kept her expression carefully neutral. Mark Sullivan personally escorted Olivia down the aisle, his body language transformed from the dismissive authority he had displayed earlier to something approaching deference. Gone was the impatient gesture, replaced by careful attention and almost excessive courtesy. "Ms. Reynolds, here's your seat," he said, gesturing to 14A with an uncomfortable attempt at courtesy. "On behalf of Horizon Airlines, I want to sincerely apologize for the confusion earlier." Confusion. The word hung in the air, a woefully inadequate description of what had actually occurred. Olivia noted it silently, still recording as her father had instructed, the subtle minimization revealing how institutional language often softened discrimination into more palatable terms. "Thank you," she replied simply, maintaining her dignity despite the temptation to point out the deliberate minimization in his language. As she settled back into her window seat, Olivia was acutely aware of Pamela Whitfield's rigid posture in the adjacent aisle seat. The woman who had so confidently declared Olivia didn't belong was now staring straight ahead, her complexion flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. Several passengers were openly recording the moment on their phones, creating a bizarre mirror of documentation. Olivia Reynolds' return to seat 14A had become a performative act of justice, witnessed and preserved from multiple angles for an audience that extended far beyond the confines of the aircraft. Flight attendant Lisa Morales approached with uncharacteristic hesitation, carrying a glass of water on a small tray, the condensation beating on the outside in perfect droplets that caught the cabin lighting. "Ms. Reynolds, can I get you anything else before we prepare for departure?" The solicitous attention, so different from the suspicious scrutiny she'd faced earlier, carried its own subtle humiliation. Olivia wasn't interested in being treated as a VIP now that her father's identity was known. She simply wanted the basic respect that should have been afforded to her as a paying passenger from the beginning. "No, thank you. This is fine," she replied, accepting the water with a neutral expression. Lisa lingered for a moment, clearly struggling with something. Finally, she lowered her voice. "I'm truly sorry for my part in what happened. It was wrong, and I should have handled it differently." The unexpected personal accountability caught Olivia off guard. In the carefully scripted corporate apologies and performances of contrition playing out around her, this simple acknowledgement of personal failure stood out for its authenticity. "Thank you for saying that," Olivia replied quietly. As Lisa moved away, Olivia glanced out the window where she could see airport vehicles gathered near the runway in the distance. Somewhere beyond them was her father's private jet, the extraordinary leverage he had deployed to ensure his daughter's dignity was respected. The thought filled her with complicated emotions: pride in his unwavering support, gratitude for his willingness to use his privilege to fight injustice, but also a deep awareness that most people facing similar discrimination had no such recourse. No private jet to block runways, no team of lawyers to demand accountability, no corporate influence to force systemic change. Her phone vibrated with a text message from her father. All conditions accepted. They'll be making a public announcement shortly. You'll be on your way to Boston soon. Remember, this isn't just about today. It's about ensuring this doesn't happen to someone else tomorrow. The message reminded her of the broader purpose behind her father's dramatic intervention. This wasn't just about getting her to the MIT program on time, or even about rectifying the specific injustice she had faced. It was about leveraging their privileged position to force accountability and change in a system that routinely allowed such discrimination to go unchallenged. Her thoughts were interrupted by the captain's voice over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Wilson. We're currently experiencing a delay in our departure clearance. We appreciate your patience and will provide updates as they become available. The deliberately vague announcement prompted murmurs throughout the cabin. Many passengers were already checking their phones, finding news about the situation developing on social media and news sites. Is it true there's a private jet blocking our runway? A businessman asked loudly, looking up from his phone where a live news feed showed aerial footage of James Reynolds' G700 positioned near the runway threshold. No one from the crew answered directly, but the question hung in the air, adding to the growing awareness that something extraordinary was unfolding. Olivia remained quiet, focusing on documenting everything as her father had instructed. The video she was recording would serve as evidence for whatever legal and corporate actions followed, ensuring that the agreements made under pressure would be honored long after the immediate crisis had passed. Carlos Rodriguez, the Hispanic passenger who had attempted to intervene earlier, caught her eye from his seat a few rows ahead. He gave her a subtle nod of respect, acknowledgement of her composure throughout the ordeal, and recognition of the broader significance of what was occurring. Olivia returned the nod with a small smile. In that brief exchange was an understanding that transcended words, a recognition that standing up for dignity sometimes required extraordinary measures, and that witnessing such moments created its own kind of responsibility. The cabin fell into an uneasy silence as the delay continued, the usual background noises of a departing flight replaced by the soft sounds of people typing on phones, sharing updates about the unprecedented situation developing outside their windows. For Olivia, the wait carried a different weight than for her fellow passengers. While they were experiencing an inconvenient delay in their travel plans, she was witnessing the direct response to an injustice she had experienced personally, a rare moment when discrimination was being met with immediate and proportional consequences. It was a lesson more valuable than anything she might learn in the MIT program she was traveling to attend, a real-world demonstration of systems, power, and the mechanics of accountability that would shape her understanding long after the technical details of quantum computing had been mastered. When Mark Sullivan reappeared at the front of the cabin 20 minutes later, accompanied by 2 other Horizon staff members, the symbolic weight of the moment was lost on no one. Justice, delayed but not denied, was about to be served. Pamela Whitfield's removal. "Miss Whitfield," Mark Sullivan said, his voice carrying through the now silent cabin. "I need you to gather your belongings and come with me. Please." Pamela looked up in shock, her expression freezing as the realization dawned that the tables had turned completely. Her manicured hand clutched her phone so tightly that her knuckles whitened, the expensive bracelet on her wrist catching the light as it trembled slightly. "Excuse me," she managed, her voice higher than normal. "You're being removed from this flight," Mark continued, professional but firm. "Your behavior toward another passenger violated our code of conduct regarding discriminatory actions." The symmetry of the moment was striking. The same authority that had been wrongfully exercised against Olivia was now being correctly applied to Pamela, a reversal that carried both justice and irony in equal measure. "This is outrageous," Pamela sputtered, color rising in her cheeks. "You can't just—" "Ma'am," Mark interrupted. "This is not a request. Your actions initiated a situation that has now affected hundreds of passengers and caused significant operational disruption. We need you to deplane immediately." Around the cabin, passengers watched with varying reactions, some visibly satisfied by the turn of events, others uncomfortable with the public nature of the confrontation regardless of its justification. The soft click of phone cameras captured the moment from multiple angles, ensuring it would live forever in digital memory. I've been flying first class on this airline for 15 years, Pamela protested, her voice rising with indignation. My company has a corporate account. Do you have any idea who I am? The question, so often used to invoke privilege and special treatment, landed with particular hollowness given the circumstances. Did she have any idea who Olivia was? Had she bothered to consider the young woman's humanity before attempting to have her removed based solely on appearance? Mark's expression remained professionally neutral. Ms. Whitfield, we're aware of your customer status. However, that doesn't exempt you from our policies regarding passenger conduct. Now, please collect your belongings. Pamela turned to Olivia, her expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. This is your doing. You've manipulated this entire situation. Olivia met her gaze steadily. I simply occupied the seat I purchased. Everything that followed was the result of your assumptions about where I belong. The simple dignity of the response seemed to momentarily silence Pamela. Reality was settling in. She had created this situation through her own prejudice, and now she was facing consequences proportional to her actions. This will not stand, she muttered, gathering her belongings with trembling hands. You'll be hearing from my attorney. We'll be happy to discuss your concerns at the gate, Mark replied, his tone making it clear that the decision was final. As Pamela stood, struggling to maintain her composure while retrieving her designer handbag from the overhead bin, the power dynamic that had defined the earlier confrontation was completely inverted. Now it was Pamela who faced the humiliation of public removal, the weight of judging eyes, the whispered comments barely concealed. My luggage is checked, she protested, grasping at procedural details in a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. We'll have your bags removed from the cargo hold and delivered to you in the terminal, one of the other Horizon staff members assured her, already gesturing toward the front of the cabin. As she made her way down the aisle, Pamela's carefully constructed facade of entitlement began to crumble visibly. Her shoulders hunched slightly, her gaze fixed on the floor ahead rather than meeting the eyes of fellow passengers. The walk of shame she had so casually inflicted on Olivia was now her own experience, a poetic justice not lost on those witnessing the reversal. Near the front of the cabin, a young woman held up her phone, clearly recording the scene. Maybe don't judge people by how they look next time, she commented, loud enough for others to hear. Pamela flinched at the words but continued forward, the reality of her situation becoming increasingly inescapable with each step. She had misjudged not just Olivia's status, but the changing social context in which such behavior was no longer shielded from consequences. At the aircraft door, she turned back briefly, scanning the cabin as if searching for sympathy or support. She found none. Even those who might have silently aligned with her earlier prejudice were now distancing themselves, unwilling to be associated with someone who had so spectacularly miscalculated. This isn't over, she declared to no one in particular, a final attempt at salvaging some illusion of power before being escorted onto the jet bridge and out of sight. As the cabin door closed behind Pamela, a subtle but perceptible shift occurred in the atmosphere on board Flight 892. The tension that had characterized the past hour didn't disappear entirely, but it transformed into something different, a collective acknowledgement that they had all witnessed something significant. Carlos Rodriguez, who had attempted to intervene earlier, spoke into the silence. That, he said with quiet satisfaction, is what accountability looks like. His comment broke the tension, eliciting nods of agreement from several passengers. A middle-aged woman across the aisle leaned toward Olivia. I'm sorry none of us spoke up more forcefully when it was happening to you, she said. It shouldn't have gotten to this point. Olivia appreciated the sincerity of the apology, but was also acutely aware of its limitations. The woman's regret, while genuine, came only after the dramatic revelation of James Reynolds' intervention. After it became clear which side of the confrontation carried more power. Thank you, Olivia replied simply, neither absolving the collective silence nor rejecting the belated solidarity. Lisa Morales returned to the first-class cabin, her professional demeanor restored, but with a new undercurrent of genuine respect as she addressed Olivia. Ms. Reynolds, we should be departing shortly. Is there anything I can get for you in the meantime? No, thank you. I'm fine, Olivia replied, still processing the extraordinary sequence of events that had transformed her journey before it had even begun. Outside on the tarmac, the consequences of Pamela's prejudice and the airline's initial compliance continued to unfold on a scale far beyond one passenger's comfort or convenience. Dozens of flights delayed, thousands of travelers affected, millions of dollars in operational costs incurred, all stemming from a moment of casual discrimination that would have gone unchallenged if directed at someone with less powerful connections. As Flight 892 finally began to taxi toward the runway, Olivia looked out the window at the sprawling airport complex. Somewhere out there, her father was watching, ensuring that the agreement he had leveraged would be honored not just in this moment, but in the systemic changes to follow. She sent him a simple text, "On our way now, thank you." His reply came almost immediately, "Always. Your dignity is non-negotiable." The words carried a lifetime of lessons about standing firm in a world that too often questioned her right to occupy spaces she had earned through her own merit. The difference was that today, that lesson had been demonstrated on a scale that would resonate far beyond their family, a public declaration that prejudice would no longer be accommodated without consequence. As the aircraft accelerated down the runway, finally beginning its journey to Boston, Olivia felt a complex mixture of emotions: vindication at seeing justice served, gratitude for her father's unwavering support, but also a sobering awareness of the privilege that had made that justice possible. Most people facing similar discrimination had no private jet to deploy, no team of lawyers to demand accountability, no corporate leverage to force systemic change. That reality would shape her understanding of the responsibility that came with the Reynolds name and resources, a responsibility to use that privilege not just for personal benefit, but for broader transformation. It was perhaps the most valuable lesson she could carry with her to MIT, more fundamental than any algorithm or equation she would study in the weeks to come. Runway cleared at 11:32 a.m., 32 minutes behind schedule. Flight 892 lifted off from runway 31L at Kennedy International Airport, banking gracefully to the northeast toward its Boston destination. From his position in the private aviation terminal, James Reynolds watched the aircraft's ascent with satisfaction, tracking its progress on both the large windows overlooking the tarmac and the flight data displayed on his tablet. The polished floors of the terminal reflected the morning sun, creating pools of light that contrasted with the serious expressions of the FAA officials waiting nearby. The consequences of his intervention were about to begin, but James faced them without hesitation or regret. Tower, Reynolds 1 requesting permission to return to hangar. Michael Davis radioed, now that their mission had been accomplished. Reynolds 1, you are cleared to return to private aviation hangar via taxiway Echo. Be advised, FAA representatives are requesting to meet with you upon arrival. The controller replied, his tone professional, but carrying an undercurrent that suggested the unusual nature of their operation hadn't gone unnoticed by federal authorities. Acknowledged, Tower. We'll cooperate fully with FAA personnel. Michael responded, exchanging a knowing glance with James. They had anticipated this response and were prepared for the consequences. As the G700 taxied toward its hangar, James received a call from Eleanor Williams, his chief legal counsel. Horizon has issued the public statement acknowledging the discriminatory incident, as agreed, she reported without preamble. They've also confirmed that termination proceedings have begun for both the gate supervisor and the flight attendant who initially removed Olivia. And the systemic changes, James asked, focusing on the broader impact beyond individual accountability. They've committed to implementing the comprehensive anti-bias training program within 60 days, with quarterly progress reports to be provided to our team. Eleanor confirmed, the $10 million donation to the National Coalition for Aviation Diversity is being processed as we speak. James nodded, satisfied that the terms he had leveraged were being honored. The immediate crisis had been resolved, but the real value lay in the lasting changes that would follow. Changes that would benefit countless passengers who lacked the resources to demand justice so dramatically. What about the FAA response, he asked, turning his attention to the regulatory consequences of his actions. As expected, they'll be issuing a significant fine for interference with commercial aviation operations, Eleanor replied. Preliminary estimate is $1.5 million, though we may be able to negotiate that down given the circumstances. Don't, James instructed, surprising his lawyer. Pay the full amount without protest. James, there are mitigating factors we could argue. The fine is appropriate, he interrupted. What we did was technically a violation, regardless of the justification. I'm willing to accept those consequences to make the point. Eleanor was silent for a moment, then acknowledged his decision. Understood. What about Michael's pilot license? They're likely to suspend it. Also appropriate, James said. Make it clear that I'll keep him on full salary and benefits during any suspension period, with a promotion to aviation director when he's reinstated. As the G700 came to a stop outside its hangar, James could see the FAA representatives waiting, their official vehicles parked nearby. The formal consequences of his intervention were about to begin, but he faced them without regret. The price, financial penalties, regulatory scrutiny, potential business complications, was one he would willingly pay again for the principle at stake. His phone chimed with a message from the airport's operations director, Victoria Alvarez. Unconventional but effective. Sometimes the system needs disruption to function properly. The message carried an unexpected note of professional respect that James appreciated. Victoria had recognized what his actions truly represented. Not lawlessness, but a calculated correction to a system that had failed in its basic obligation to treat all passengers with equal dignity. As he prepared to disembark and face the FAA officials, James received a final update from Maria at his office. Sir, Horizon Airlines stock is down 11% and still falling. Their customer service lines are overwhelmed with calls, and cancellations are running at 5 times normal volume. The hashtag flight privilege is trending nationwide with over 300,000 posts in the last hour. The market consequences were already exceeding James's projections. The incident had struck a chord with the public, resonating with countless individuals who had experienced similar discrimination but lacked the platform or power to demand accountability. Thank you, Maria. Keep monitoring the situation, but we've accomplished what we needed to. James replied, gathering his belongings as the aircraft door opened. The 2 FAA officials approached with the serious expressions of regulators preparing to address a significant violation. James greeted them with professional courtesy. Gentlemen, I understand you have concerns about our operations today. I'm prepared to cooperate fully and accept any appropriate consequences. The lead inspector, a veteran FAA administrator named Richard Torres, maintained his official demeanor despite the unusual circumstances. Mr. Reynolds, your aircraft deliberately obstructed a commercial runway using a false mechanical issue as pretext. That constitutes a serious violation of federal aviation regulations. I acknowledge that, James replied calmly, and I'm prepared to accept whatever penalties are deemed appropriate. The frank admission seemed to momentarily throw Torres off script. Most violations were met with denial, justification, or attempts to minimize responsibility. May I ask why you took such an extreme action? Torres inquired, his curiosity seemingly genuine beneath the professional exterior. Because the alternative was allowing my 17-year-old daughter to be humiliated and discriminated against without consequence. James replied simply, some principles are worth paying for. Torres nodded slightly, neither approving nor condemning the reasoning. We'll need formal statements from both you and your pilot. There will be substantial penalties, and Mr. Davis's license will likely be suspended pending review. We understand, James confirmed. You're doing your job, just as I was doing mine as a father. As the official proceedings began, James glanced at his phone one last time, checking the FlightAware app that showed Flight 892 continuing its journey to Boston. Olivia would arrive in time for the MIT program opening, her future uncompromised by the prejudice that had threatened to derail it. That was what mattered most, not just that his daughter had reached her destination, but that she had done so with her dignity intact and with the powerful knowledge that she was worth fighting for. The regulatory consequences that now unfolded around James were merely the cost of that lesson, a price he considered insignificant compared to the value of what had been preserved and the message that had been sent. Flight to Boston at 33,000 feet above the eastern seaboard, Flight 892, had settled into the smooth routine of a short domestic journey. The seatbelt signs were off. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with beverages and snacks, and most passengers had returned to their books, laptops, or in-flight entertainment. Outside Olivia's window, the clear blue sky stretched endlessly, punctuated by occasional wisps of cloud that drifted past like ethereal sculptures. The sunlight cast a warm glow across the cabin, catching in the condensation on drink glasses and creating tiny rainbows on tray tables. But in seat 14A, Olivia Reynolds remained acutely aware that this was no ordinary flight. The empty seat beside her, where Pamela Whitfield should have been, served as a physical reminder of the extraordinary events that had preceded takeoff. Around her, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin carried a subtle undercurrent of awareness, as if the space itself had been transformed by the confrontation and its resolution. Carlos Rodriguez, who had attempted to intervene earlier, had been moved to the now vacant 14B seat beside Olivia. The airline staff had made the change without announcement, a quiet acknowledgement that Olivia might appreciate having an ally nearby after what she'd experienced. "Your father, Miss Boando," Carlos said after they'd been in the air for about 20 minutes, his voice low enough to ensure privacy in the intimate confines of the cabin. "He must be quite something." Olivia smiled slightly, appreciating the understatement. "He believes in proportional responses." Blocking a commercial airliner with a private jet, Carlos raised an eyebrow, the corner of his mouth lifting in amused respect. "That's certainly proportional to something. To the message it sends," Olivia clarified, adjusting her seat slightly as the aircraft encountered a patch of mild turbulence. "He wanted to make sure this wasn't dismissed as just another incident." Carlos nodded thoughtfully, the lines around his eyes crinkling as he considered her words. "I've been flying for business for 23 years. I've seen this happen dozens of times. People questioned, moved, harassed, always with the same pattern of who gets targeted. But I've never seen consequences like this." The observation carried the weight of lived experience, a recognition that what had occurred wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a persistent pattern that had gone unchallenged for too long. "My dad says systems only change when the cost of continuing bad behavior exceeds the cost of reform," Olivia said, repeating one of James's frequent insights about institutional transformation. "Smart man," Carlos replied. "Today, he made discrimination expensive for Horizon Airlines. Really expensive." Olivia's phone vibrated with an incoming message. It was from her mother, Denise. "Dad told me what happened. Are you okay, sweetheart? So proud of how you handled yourself." The message brought unexpected tears to Olivia's eyes, not from the humiliation she'd experienced, but from the realization of how completely she was supported. While her father had deployed his resources to ensure justice, her mother had focused immediately on Olivia's emotional well-being. "I'm fine, Mom. Really, we'll call when we land," she typed back. As she put her phone away, Olivia noticed Lisa Morales approaching with the tablet in hand. "Miss Reynolds," the flight attendant said, her manner now respectfully professional rather than performatively deferential. "The captain asked me to share this with you." She handed Olivia the tablet, which displayed a news article that had just been published online. The headline read, "Horizon Airlines issues public apology after racial profiling incident, announces major policy changes." The accompanying image showed a serious-looking Horizon executive behind a podium, while a smaller inset photo, clearly taken from social media, showed Olivia in her MIT hoodie at a science competition from the previous year. "Thank you," Olivia said, accepting the tablet with mixed emotions about seeing herself at the center of a national news story. The article detailed the incident without naming Pamela Whitfield, but described the discriminatory removal of a young African-American passenger with a valid first-class ticket after another passenger complained about her presence. It outlined Horizon's commitment to implementing comprehensive anti-bias training, a review of all customer service protocols, and a $10 million donation to the National Coalition for Aviation Diversity. Most significantly, it acknowledged that the airline had failed to uphold our commitment to treating all passengers with equal dignity and respect, and would be taking immediate personnel actions regarding the staff involved in this unacceptable incident. As Olivia read, she realized this was only the beginning. The article mentioned that hashtag Horizon Discrimination and hashtag Flying While Black were trending nationwide, with thousands sharing their own experiences of prejudice in air travel. "It's already being discussed in our company forums," Carlos commented, glancing at his own phone. "Every airline executive in the country is watching this unfold. Believe me." The impact was expanding beyond one flight, one airline, or even one industry. What had begun as a personal humiliation was catalyzing a broader conversation about who belonged in which spaces and how institutions responded when that belonging was challenged. As the Massachusetts coastline became visible through her window, the irregular outline of Cape Cod reaching like a curved arm into the Atlantic, Olivia received another message, this one from Dr. Amanda Foster, the MIT professor leading the quantum computing summer program. Olivia, we've seen the news. A car will meet you at Boston Logan Terminal. Don't worry about today's schedule. We're just glad you'll be arriving safely. Your room at the residence hall is ready whenever you get here. The consideration was touching, but Olivia was determined not to let the incident define her entry into the program she had worked so hard to join. Thank you, Dr. Foster. I appreciate the arrangement, but I'd like to join today's activities as originally scheduled if possible. This was a detour, not a destination. The response came quickly. Understood. The car will take you directly to the afternoon lecture. Impressive resolve, Mrs. Reynolds. As the aircraft began its descent into Boston Logan International Airport, Lisa approached one final time. Ms. Reynolds, the captain would like to speak with you briefly after we land, if that's acceptable. Olivia nodded, curious about this unusual request. Of course. The landing was smooth, the taxi to the gate efficient. As other passengers gathered their belongings and prepared to deplane, Captain Robert Wilson emerged from the cockpit, still in his uniform with 4 stripes on the shoulders. He was a man in his early 50s with silver-flecked hair and the confident bearing of someone who had spent decades in command of aircraft. He approached Olivia's seat and spoke quietly. Ms. Reynolds, I wanted to personally apologize for what occurred before departure. It happened under my ultimate authority, and that responsibility is not something I take lightly. The sincerity in his voice was evident, not the corporate damage control that had characterized some of the earlier apologies, but a genuine acknowledgement of professional failure. As a black man who started flying commercially in the 1990s, he continued, I've seen too many incidents like this from both sides. What your father did today, making it impossible to ignore, that matters. It changes conversations in places you'll never see. Thank you, Captain, Olivia replied, touched by the personal connection. That means a lot. As she finally deplaned and walked through Boston Logan toward the waiting car, Olivia felt the weight of the day's events settling into perspective. What had begun as a personal humiliation had transformed into something with far greater significance, a moment when the persistent reality of everyday discrimination had been met with consequences substantial enough to force institutional reflection. The MIT program awaited, with all its intellectual challenges and opportunities, but Olivia carried with her now an additional education. Celie won in power, systems, and the mechanics of accountability that would inform her understanding long after the technical details of quantum computing had been mastered. As the car pulled away from the terminal, Olivia sent a final message to her father. Landed safely and heading to MIT. Now, thank you for showing me what it means to make principles non-negotiable. His response was simple, but carried the weight of everything they had always understood about navigating the world as a black family of achievement. Excellence is the best response to prejudice, but sometimes a Gulfstream G700 makes the point more clearly. Love you, honeybee. Olivia smiled, tucking her phone away as the Boston skyline came into view. The confrontation at Kennedy was behind her now, but its lessons about dignity, consequence, and the responsibility that came with privilege would remain with her long after today's extraordinary journey had ended. Part 6. Widespread consequences. By the time Flight 892 touched down in Boston, the incident at Kennedy Airport had transcended from a local disruption to a viral phenomenon that dominated social media platforms nationwide. What had begun as a few passenger recordings had morphed into a full-fledged digital movement, with the hashtags #FlyingWhileBlack and #Horizon Airlines trending at numbers 1 and 2 respectively across multiple platforms. The initial video, recorded by a teenager in row 7 who had captured Olivia's original removal from the aircraft, had been viewed over 4.7 million times in just 3 hours. The clip showed Olivia's composed dignity as she was escorted off the plane, contrasted with Pamela Whitfield's visible satisfaction at the outcome. This happened today at JFK. Black teenager with valid first-class ticket removed after white woman complained. Then her dad blocked the entire runway with his private jet until they let her back on #FlyingWhileBlack, #Horizon Airlines, #JFK, read the caption. The follow-up video of Pamela's subsequent removal had already surpassed the original in views, reaching 5.2 million with shares from celebrities, politicians, and major media accounts. Comment sections overflowed with reactions. The look on that woman's face when they came for her, instead pure cinema. This is how you use privilege to fight privilege. Dad of the Year Award. Imagine being so racist you cost your airline millions in delays and damage control. In Horizon Airlines' social media command center, a glass-walled room at their Dallas headquarters filled with monitors tracking brand mentions across platforms, the mood had shifted from crisis management to damage mitigation. The metrics displayed on their dashboards told a devastating story. Mentions up 4,700% compared to daily average, sentiment 83%, negative engagement, 2 million direct interactions in 3 hours, stock price down 14% and still falling. Social media director Allison Parker had been in her position for 5 years, managing everything from weather delays to celebrity complaints, but nothing had prepared her for the scale and intensity of this response. It's not just the incident itself that's driving this, she explained to the crisis management team assembled around the conference table. It's the David versus Goliath narrative, except in this case, both sides had resources. People are fascinated by a father who could actually force accountability through such dramatic means. On the main display, a real-time feed showed tweets, posts, and videos proliferating faster than their team could possibly track manually. Their sentiment analysis software was categorizing the content into themes: racial discrimination in travel, 42%, corporate accountability, 28%, wealth and privilege dynamics, 16%, aviation operations/regulations 9%, other miscellaneous 5%. The secondary narratives are actually more damaging long-term, Allison continued, pointing to a cluster of posts. People are sharing their own experiences of discrimination on flights, not just on our airline, but across the industry. This has become a catalyst for a much broader conversation. Indeed, the hashtag #MyFlyingWhileBlack story had emerged organically, with thousands of passengers recounting similar experiences of being questioned, moved, or subjected to extra scrutiny while traveling. Many included details like dates, flight numbers, and employee names, creating a damning digital archive of discriminatory patterns that had previously remained isolated individual experiences. I was asked to move from first class on Horizon Air last year because a white passenger didn't feel comfortable. Flight attendant actually said that. #MyFlyingWhileBlack story. Asked for a pre-flight drink 3 times in business class while white passengers all around me got served immediately. When I finally asked why I was being ignored, the FA said, "I'll get to you when I can." #MyFlyingWhileBlack story. What made this particular incident so potent on social media was the clear resolution and consequences, elements often missing from viral outrage cycles. People weren't just sharing their anger, they were celebrating that for once. Discrimination had met immediate and proportional response. Reynolds is trending as a hero, noted Thomas Garcia, PR manager, scrolling through his tablet. His intervention is being framed as what allyship actually looks like when you have power. The team's monitoring tools showed that discussion was expanding beyond social media into mainstream news coverage. All major networks had broken into regular programming with special reports. Aviation correspondents were being rushed to Kennedy Airport for live stand-ups. Business analysts were discussing the impact on Horizon's stock price and the potential industry-wide implications. On cable news channels, split-screen debates featured aviation experts, civil rights attorneys, and corporate ethics specialists analyzing the intersection of race, wealth, corporate responsibility, and federal regulations that the incident had exposed. The narrative is completely beyond our control at this point, Allison acknowledged, her expression grim. Our statement is being ratioed with comments like, too little, too late, and only apologizing because you got caught. The ratio, where negative responses to a corporate statement vastly outnumbered positive engagements, was a digital indicator of failed crisis management. Horizon's carefully crafted apology had garnered over 87,000 responses, most challenging its sincerity or demanding more specific action. What made this particularly challenging from a corporate perspective was that James Reynolds had effectively seized control of the narrative through his dramatic intervention. Rather than the typical cycle of incident, outrage, corporate statement, and gradual fading of attention, Reynolds had forced immediate accountability through his unprecedented runway blockade. "We're seeing significant booking impacts already," Thomas reported, checking real-time data from their reservation systems. "Cancellations are up 340% compared to normal volume, and new bookings have dropped by 62% in the last hour." The financial consequences were extending beyond Horizon to affect the entire industry. Stock prices for major competitors had dipped an average of 3–5% as investors recognized the broader implications. If one passenger with powerful connections could force such dramatic accountability, what might this mean for an industry that had long managed discriminatory incidents primarily through damage control rather than systemic change? On LinkedIn, aviation executives were posting unusually candid reflections on the need for industry-wide reform and training, protocol, and accountability. The professional networking site, typically a space for carefully crafted corporate messaging, had become a forum for soul-searching about institutional biases that had persisted despite decades of diversity initiatives. "This is unprecedented," Allison said, pointing to one particularly striking metric. "Look at the demographic breakdown of engagement." The data showed that unlike many racial incidents that tended to create polarized response along racial lines, this story was generating remarkably consistent engagement and sentiment across demographic categories. The clear-cut nature of the discrimination, combined with the dramatic response and institutional accountability, had created a narrative that transcended typical divisions. White, middle-aged business travelers, Horizon's core customer base, were among the most engaged groups, many expressing variations of the same sentiment. "This could have been my daughter/son family member." As the crisis team continued monitoring the digital fallout, a notification appeared on the main screen. James Reynolds had just posted his first public statement about the incident on his rarely used Twitter account. "Today, my daughter, Olivia Reynolds, was removed from a Horizon Air flight despite having a valid first-class ticket, solely because another passenger didn't think she belonged there. My response was proportional to ensure this doesn't happen to someone else's child tomorrow." #dignity is non-negotiable. The simple, measured statement, accompanied by a link to Horizon's public apology, was being retweeted thousands of times per minute, adding new fuel to the already raging conversation. Within minutes, Olivia's own account had gained over 200,000 new followers, though she had not yet posted about the incident herself. Her previous content, primarily focused on quantum computing, science competitions, and occasional posts about music, was being scoured for insights into the young woman at the center of the viral moment. What followers found only enhanced the narrative a brilliant teenager headed to MIT, whose accomplishments spoke for themselves, subjected to humiliation based solely on assumptions about where she belonged. "We need to prepare for at least 2 more news cycles on this," Thomas advised the team. "Tomorrow will be the personal impact stories and industry analysis. Day 3 will be the broader societal implications and calls for regulation." As the crisis team continued their monitoring and response efforts, one thing had become abundantly clear: what had begun as one passenger's prejudice, compounded by corporate complicity, had catalyzed a national conversation about race, privilege, accountability, and belonging in American public spaces. The digital wildfire showed no signs of burning out anytime soon. Pamela Whitfield's downfall. Pamela Whitfield sat alone in the first-class lounge at Kennedy Airport, her designer handbag clutched tightly in her lap as though it might shield her from the reality closing in from all sides. The private corner she had selected offered momentary refuge, but the glances from other travelers made it clear her anonymity was rapidly evaporating. The lounge's soft lighting and muted color scheme, typically designed to create an atmosphere of exclusive comfort, now felt like a stage set for her public humiliation. The hushed conversations and occasional glances in her direction made it clear that word of her role in the incident was spreading even in this haven for premium travelers. Her phone, which she checked compulsively every few minutes, displayed an increasingly apocalyptic series of notifications. Social media alerts, text messages, emails, all converging into a digital tsunami that threatened to sweep away the carefully constructed facade of success and influence she had maintained for decades. "Pamela, are you seeing this? You're all over Twitter. Call me immediately." The text from her assistant was just one of dozens from increasingly panicked colleagues and associates. With trembling fingers, Pamela opened Twitter to find that internet sleuths had already identified her. Her full name, professional biography, company website, and LinkedIn profile had been assembled and shared thousands of times. Screenshots from her company's diversity statement, ironically promising inclusive excellence in all client interactions, were being juxtaposed with footage of her demanding Olivia's removal from the flight. The top comment, with over 45,000 likes, reads simply, "The woman who thinks Black people don't belong in first class runs a company that trains others on professional excellence. You can't make this up." As Pamela scrolled in horror, her phone rang. Christine Morgan, the chairperson of the Metropolitan Art Foundation, where Pamela held a coveted board position. "Christine?" Pamela answered, attempting to maintain composure. "I was just about to call you. This situation is being completely misrepresented." "Pamela, stop," Christine interrupted, her voice clipped and formal. "The executive committee held an emergency call 10 minutes ago. Your actions directly contradict our mission of inclusivity and community access to the arts. We're issuing a statement distancing the foundation from your behavior, effective immediately." "You can't possibly," Pamela began, but Christine continued without pause. "Your resignation letter has already been drafted and will be released within the hour. This is not a negotiation, it's a notification." The call ended before Pamela could respond, leaving her staring at her phone in disbelief. The Metropolitan Art Foundation board seat had been the cornerstone of her social standing in New York, a position she had leveraged for connections, status, and client relationships. Before she could process this blow, an email notification appeared from Jameson Carter, CEO of Carter Financial, her largest consulting client. "Pamela, in light of today's events, which directly contradict our corporate values, Carter Financial is terminating our relationship with Whitfield Excellence, effective immediately. All scheduled training sessions are canceled. Please have your legal team contact us regarding the termination clauses in our contract." 3 more similar emails followed in rapid succession. Clients severing ties, partners distancing themselves, professional organizations reviewing her membership status. The corporate exodus was happening in real time. Each notification another brick removed from the foundation of her professional identity. A text from her daughter, Catherine, with whom she'd had a strained relationship for years, delivered perhaps the most personal blow. "Mom, I've just seen the videos. This is exactly why we barely speak anymore. Your treatment of that young woman is inexcusable. Please do not contact me until you've done serious reflection about who you've become." Pamela's hand trembled so severely she nearly dropped her phone. The public humiliation was devastating, but her daughter's judgment cut deeper than any corporate severance or social media outrage. A notification from her banking app broke through her momentary paralysis, an alert that would normally have been routine but now carried ominous significance. "Whitfield Excellence LLC, unusual account activity detected." Clients weren't just canceling future contracts, they were initiating chargebacks and payment reversals for services already rendered, citing breach of ethical standards clauses in their agreements. Her company's cash flow, already precarious due to post-pandemic adjustments, was now in freefall. A discreet cough interrupted her spiraling thoughts. A lounge attendant stood nearby, maintaining professional courtesy despite obvious discomfort. "Ms. Whitfield, I apologize for the intrusion, but several guests have expressed concern about your presence in the lounge. The manager would like to speak with you." The final indignity, being removed from yet another exclusive space, this time not because of someone else's complaint, but because of her own exposed behavior. As Pamela gathered her belongings, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in a nearby window. The carefully maintained facade of success and sophistication had cracked, revealing something she had spent decades denying: the desperate insecurity that drove her need to exclude others in order to validate her own belonging. In the manager's office, away from public view, Pamela was informed that her lounge privileges were being temporarily suspended pending review, a corporate euphemism for permanent expulsion. Her airline status, accumulated over 15 years of loyalty, was under similar review. "We can arrange for you to wait in a private area until your flight," the manager offered, clearly eager to remove Pamela from any space where she might be recognized. "When is my flight?" Pamela asked numbly, having lost track of time as her professional life imploded around her. "We have you confirmed on the 5:30 p.m. departure to LaGuardia," the manager replied, checking his tablet. LaGuardia, not even a different city. Just a humiliating return to the same New York she had left that morning as a respected professional and would now re-enter as a social pariah. In the private waiting area, essentially a converted office with a chair and small table, Pamela finally allowed herself to fully confront the reality of her situation. In less than 6 hours, her carefully constructed life had unraveled completely. Her professional reputation was destroyed. Her client base was evaporating. Her social standing was in ruins. Even her daughter had disowned her. And unlike most viral outrage cycles where the target could retreat into anonymity until the news cycle moved on, Pamela's humiliation had been immortalized by multiple video angles, professional news coverage, and the historic nature of Reynolds' response. She would forever be known as the woman whose prejudice was so egregious it prompted a billionaire to block an entire airport runway with his private jet. As she waited for her return flight, Pamela received one final message from her therapist, whom she had been seeing for anxiety management. "Pamela, I've seen the news. This is a profound opportunity for growth and self-examination. When you're ready to discuss what happened from a place of genuine accountability rather than defensiveness, I'm here." It was perhaps the only communication she had received that offered any pathway forward, however difficult and humbling that path might be. As she boarded her flight back to LaGuardia, seated in economy, her first-class privileges suspended, Pamela Whitfield confronted the ultimate irony of her situation. She had attempted to exclude someone from a space based on prejudiced assumptions about belonging, only to find herself systematically excluded from the professional and social spaces that had defined her identity. The symmetry of the consequence was poetic in its precision, a lesson in belonging and exclusion delivered with unmistakable clarity. Airline industry response. In the corporate headquarters of major airlines across the country, emergency executive sessions had been convened within hours of the Kennedy Airport incident going viral. What had begun as one airline's public relations crisis had rapidly expanded into an industry-wide reckoning as similar stories of discrimination flooded social media platforms and news outlets. At American Airlines Fort Worth Command Center, CEO Rachel Mendez addressed her assembled leadership team with uncharacteristic bluntness. "Let me be absolutely clear," she began, her tone leaving no room for equivocation. "What happened at Kennedy today could have happened on any of our flights. We all know it, and denying that reality won't help us navigate what's coming." Around the conference table, senior executives nodded grimly. The industry's uncomfortable truth that discriminatory incidents were handled primarily through damage control rather than preventive measures had been publicly exposed in the most dramatic fashion possible. Reynolds didn't just create a crisis for Horizon, Rachel continued, pacing slowly at the head of the table. He created a moment of forced accountability for every carrier. The question isn't whether we'll be expected to respond, but how substantively we choose to do so. The spacious boardroom with its panoramic views of the Dallas skyline usually hosted strategic planning sessions and quarterly reviews. Today, it had been transformed into a war room where industry leaders confronted a threat not to their planes or operations, but to their fundamental approach to passenger treatment. Similar conversations were unfolding at Delta's Atlanta headquarters, United's Chicago offices, and Southwest Dallas Operations Center. The unprecedented nature of a private citizen using his resources to force immediate accountability had shifted the typical crisis response calculus. "The standard playbook isn't going to work here," explained Diversify Analysis, a crisis management firm hastily retained by several major carriers. "Issuing a statement about reviewing procedures or recommitting to diversity will be seen as performative in this climate. The Reynolds intervention has created demand for concrete, measurable action." And within 24 hours of the incident, a cascade of industry announcements began. American Airlines announced the creation of an independent passenger advocacy office with authority to override gate agent decisions in potential discrimination cases. Delta unveiled a comprehensive revision to its training protocols, including mandatory quarterly bias recognition sessions for all customer-facing staff. United committed to implementing body cameras for all gate agents to provide objective documentation of passenger interactions, with footage to be reviewed by a diverse committee. Southwest announced a partnership with civil rights organizations to develop a new set of best practices for ensuring equitable treatment during boarding, seating, and in-flight service. What made these responses notable was their departure from the typically cautious corporate approach to social issues. The financial and operational implications of these commitments were substantial, reflecting a recognition that the cost of inaction now exceeded the cost of reform, exactly as James Reynolds had calculated. In industry forums and professional aviation groups, the conversation had shifted from damage control to fundamental reevaluation of practices that had persisted despite decades of incremental diversity initiatives. We've been addressing these issues as isolated incidents rather than systemic patterns, admitted William Harrington, operations director for a major regional carrier, during an emergency industry webinar attended by over 500 aviation professionals. Reynolds forced us to confront the cumulative impact of thousands of isolated incidents that follow consistent patterns. The cold financial reality was equally compelling. Horizon's stock had plummeted 28% in a single day, the largest single-day drop in the company's history. Booking data showed cancellations running at 5 times normal volume, with new reservations down by over 60%. Industry analysts estimated the total financial impact, including operational costs, compensation requirements, and lost future business, would exceed $300 million. Other airlines recognized their vulnerability to similar incidents and the potential for even more severe financial consequences if they failed to implement preventive measures. Beyond the corporate responses, regulatory attention had been immediately triggered. The Department of Transportation announced an industry-wide review of compliance with non-discrimination policies in air travel. The FAA indicated it would be evaluating whether existing civil rights protections for passengers were being adequately enforced. Congressional leaders from both parties called for hearings on discriminatory practices in commercial aviation, with several proposing legislation to strengthen passenger protection regulations and increase penalties for violations. Perhaps most significant was the shift in internal industry culture. In private forums and professional networks, aviation employees at all levels were engaging in unusually candid discussions about biases they had witnessed or participated in during their careers. "I've seen this happen dozens of times in my 15 years as a flight attendant," wrote one employee on an internal discussion board. "We're trained to defer to high-value customers when conflicts arise, which creates an inherent bias against those who don't fit the traditional profile of a first-class passenger." Haas flight crews shared stories of being pressured to accommodate discriminatory requests from passengers. Gate agents admitted to applying rules more strictly for certain demographics, and managers acknowledged failing to address documented patterns of unequal treatment. This internal reckoning extended to hiring and promotion practices, with recognition that the demographic composition of customer service teams, particularly in premium cabins and first-class lounges, often reinforced implicit biases about who belonged in these spaces. At Horizon's competitor airlines, the message from leadership had shifted from defensive distance, "This couldn't happen here," to proactive assessment, "How do we prevent this from happening here?" Reynolds didn't just block a runway, observed aviation industry analyst Sophia Patel in a widely shared LinkedIn post. He blocked the industry's ability to dismiss these incidents as anomalies. By making discrimination expensive, literally halting a multi-million-dollar operation in its tracks, he forced a financial reckoning that decades of moral arguments hadn't achieved. The industry's response reflected this new calculation. Airlines were implementing changes not just because it was ethically right, but because it had become operationally necessary and financially prudent. In boardrooms across the country, executives who had previously viewed diversity initiatives primarily as marketing considerations now recognized them as core operational priorities with direct impact on the bottom line. It was, in many ways, exactly the systemic transformation James Reynolds had intended when he positioned his G700 at the threshold of runway 31L, a demonstration that when the cost of discrimination becomes sufficiently high, institutional change will follow as a matter of practical necessity. Legal and regulatory fallout. The conference room at the Department of Transportation's Washington headquarters had been hastily converted into a command center. Secretary Elena Fuentes had canceled her scheduled appearances to personally oversee the federal response to what was rapidly evolving from an isolated incident into a catalyst for potential regulatory overhaul. Maps of the nation's air traffic system covered one wall, while monitors displayed real-time social media trends, news coverage, and legal analyses. The buzz of focused activity filled the room as teams of specialists tracked developments and prepared response options. The preliminary data is troubling, to say the least, Federal Prosecutor William Bennett explained. gesturing to the statistics displayed on the main screen. We've been monitoring discrimination complaints in commercial aviation for years, but what the Reynolds incident has unleashed is unprecedented. The dashboard showed a 3,400% increase in formal complaints filed through the DOT's Aviation Consumer Protection Division in the 48 hours since the Kennedy Airport incident. Thousands of passengers who had previously endured similar treatment without official recourse were now coming forward with detailed accounts, many supported by documentation, witnesses, and in some cases, video evidence. What's particularly significant, William continued, is that we're seeing clear patterns across carriers, routes, and time periods. This isn't a Horizon Airlines problem or a Kennedy Airport problem. It's a commercial aviation cultural problem. Secretary Fuentes studied the data with growing concern, her fingers drumming a quiet rhythm on the polished conference table. The geographical distribution of incidents covered every major airport in the country. The demographic analysis showed consistent patterns regarding which passengers were most likely to face additional scrutiny, be removed from flights, or have their legitimate complaints dismissed. This constitutes potential violations of multiple federal statutes. William concluded, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, the Air Carrier Access Act, and potentially the Federal Aviation Act's non-discrimination provisions. And what about the Reynolds intervention itself? Secretary Fuentes asked. Where do we stand on the regulatory response to his runway blockade? This question addressed the delicate balance facing federal authorities. While James Reynolds had technically violated FAA regulations by obstructing a commercial runway, his actions had exposed systemic discrimination that federal oversight had failed to address effectively. The FAA has issued the standard fine for runway interference, $1.5 million. William explained. Reynolds paid it immediately, without protest or negotiation. His pilot's license has been suspended for 6 months, which he also accepted without appeal. So he deliberately accepted the consequences, Secretary Fuentes observed, leaning back in her chair. Yes, and that's created an interesting dynamic in public perception. By acknowledging that his actions were technically improper but morally justified, he's positioned himself as someone willing to bear personal costs to expose a larger injustice. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jonathan Hayes, the department's chief of staff, with breaking news. Madam Secretary, Congressman Davis has just announced oversight hearings on discriminatory practices in commercial aviation, scheduled to begin next week. They're requesting your testimony, as well as CEOs from all major carriers. This development accelerated the timeline significantly. Congressional hearings would bring public scrutiny and political pressure that could fundamentally reshape the regulatory approach to passenger protections. We need to be prepared with concrete policy recommendations, Secretary Fuentes decided. Not just enforcement of existing regulations, but potential new frameworks to address the systematic nature of these issues. Across town at the Justice Department, a parallel process was unfolding as civil rights attorneys evaluated the federal case for intervention. The Civil Rights Division had initiated a formal investigation into patterns and practices of discrimination in commercial aviation, with particular focus on how airlines handled passenger conflicts involving racial components. The Reynolds case gives us a perfect entry point, explained Danielle Washington, Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. It's not just about one incident, but about establishing industry-wide accountability for discriminatory patterns that have persisted despite decades of civil rights legislation. The legal implications extended beyond federal civil rights enforcement to potential class action lawsuits, representing thousands of passengers who had experienced similar discrimination. Several major firms had already announced investigations into potential litigation, with one prominent class action specialist describing the situation as potentially the largest civil rights transportation case since interstate bus desegregation. For Horizon Airlines specifically, the legal exposure was immediate and severe. Beyond the civil rights implications, the airline faced potential liability for breach of contract with thousands of affected passengers whose flights had been delayed or canceled due to the runway blockage, delays that were ultimately traced to the airline's own discriminatory actions rather than Reynolds' response. In regulatory agencies across Washington, the incident had triggered reassessment of enforcement priorities. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was examining whether airlines' loyalty programs and credit card partnerships created discriminatory impacts in access to premium travel services. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was reviewing whether airlines' hiring and promotion practices contributed to the cultural environment that enabled such incidents. The most significant regulatory response, however, came from the Federal Aviation Administration itself. Beyond the standard fine issued to Reynolds for the runway interference, the agency announced a comprehensive review of how discrimination concerns were integrated into safety and operational protocols. We've historically treated passenger discrimination as primarily a customer service issue rather than a safety concern, explained FAA Administrator Gregory Morrison during a press briefing. The Reynolds incident forces us to reconsider that approach. When discriminatory actions lead to improper removal of passengers with valid tickets, that constitutes a breakdown in the systematic application of safety protocols. This reframing, elevating discrimination from a customer service failure to a safety and operational integrity issue, carried profound implications for how airlines would be regulated. Safety violations triggered more rigorous reporting requirements, stricter penalties, and more intensive federal oversight than customer service complaints. Within the FAA's sprawling bureaucracy, task forces were being assembled to develop new training requirements, reporting mechanisms, and compliance metrics specifically focused on equitable application of safety and boarding protocols regardless of passenger demographics. For James Reynolds, the legal consequences of his intervention were playing out exactly as he had anticipated. The FAA fine, while substantial at $1.5 million, represented an acceptable cost for the systemic change his actions had catalyzed. His legal team was now focused not on minimizing his personal consequences, but on leveraging the incident to maximum effect in forcing industry-wide reform. Mr. Reynolds isn't interested in punitive damages or personal compensation, his chief counsel explained in a statement to the press. His objective is structural change in how commercial aviation addresses discriminatory practices. The concrete commitments we've secured from Horizon Airlines, including the $10 million contribution to the National Coalition for Aviation Diversity, the implementation of comprehensive anti-bias training, and the creation of an independent passenger advocacy office, represent the kind of substantive reform we expect to see industry-wide. This approach, using legal leverage to force systemic change rather than monetary compensation, reflected Reynolds' strategic understanding of how to transform institutions. The $1.5 million fine he paid without protest was effectively an investment in catalyzing regulatory and legal processes that would ultimately cost the aviation industry hundreds of millions to address. As Secretary Fuentes concluded her emergency briefing with federal prosecutors and regulatory specialists, she summarized the unprecedented situation facing the aviation industry. What we're witnessing is a regulatory inflection point. Reynolds didn't just expose one incident of discrimination. He forced a confrontation with decades of insufficient oversight and enforcement. Our response must be proportional, not just to what happened at Kennedy Airport, but to the systematic failures it represents. The message to the aviation industry was clear: the legal and regulatory environment had fundamentally changed. Discrimination would no longer be treated as an occasional public relations problem to be managed through damage control, but as a structural failure requiring comprehensive reform under intensified federal oversight. It was, perhaps, the most significant legacy of James Reynolds' runway blockade, forcing accountability not just from one airline, but from the entire regulatory framework that had allowed such incidents to persist despite decades of civil rights legislation. Part 7. Long-term impact and epilogue. 6 months later. Olivia at MIT. The Quantum Computing Research Laboratory at MIT hummed with the distinctive sound of scientific innovation, the soft whir of cooling systems for the experimental processors, the click of keyboards as students work through the complex algorithms, and the animated discussions of brilliant minds pushing the boundaries of computational possibility. In the center of Lab 4, Olivia Reynolds stood before a whiteboard covered in equations and diagrams, explaining her approach to a particularly challenging quantum optimization problem. 6 months into the program that had begun with such dramatic circumstances, she had established herself as one of its most promising participants. The key insight, she explained to the small group gathered around her, gesturing to a complex matrix notation she'd developed, is that we don't need to maintain quantum coherence across the entire calculation. We can segment the problem into classical and quantum components, using quantum processes only where they provide genuine advantage. The whiteboard behind her displayed her innovative hybrid approach, a methodology that combined quantum computing's probabilistic power with classical computing's deterministic efficiency. The equations flowed across the board in her neat handwriting, representing months of theoretical work now ready for experimental validation. Professor Amanda Foster nodded appreciatively from the back of the group. Olivia's hybrid approach reduces resource requirements by approximately 40% while maintaining computational integrity. It's a significant contribution to making quantum algorithms practical for real-world diagnostic applications. The validation from one of the field's leading researchers would have been gratifying under any circumstances. But for Olivia, it carried additional significance. Confirmation that she belonged in this space through the merit of her ideas rather than any external factors. As the presentation concluded and the group dispersed to their workstations, Amanda approached Olivia privately. The medical diagnostics team at Boston General is very interested in your algorithm for tumor detection, she said. They'd like you to present at their research symposium next month. It would be an opportunity to move your work from theoretical to practical application. Olivia's eyes widened slightly. Their research symposium, but that's usually reserved for established researchers and faculty. Usually, sir. Yes, Amanda acknowledged with a smile. But your work merits the exception. Your approach to quantum pattern recognition in heterogeneous tissue samples is exactly what they've been looking for. The invitation represented exactly what Olivia had hoped to achieve, creating quantum computing applications with real-world impact, particularly in medical diagnostics. Her grandmother's misdiagnosis 3 years earlier had sparked this mission, and now it was moving from concept to potential implementation. Later that evening, as Olivia worked late in the lab fine-tuning her algorithm, Sophia Martinez, another program participant, stopped by her workstation. A bunch of us are heading to that new Thai place on Massachusetts Avenue, she said, leaning against the desk. You should join. The casual invitation highlighted how much had changed over the past 6 months. When Olivia had first arrived at MIT in the wake of the Kennedy Airport incident, her interactions with fellow participants had been awkward and strained. Many had seen the viral videos and news coverage, creating an unspoken barrier between her and the rest of the group. Some had been uncomfortably deferential, hyper-aware of her inadvertent fame and her father's dramatic intervention. Others had been subtly resentful, wondering if her presence in the program had been influenced by the publicity surrounding the discrimination incident. Olivia had navigated this challenging social terrain by focusing relentlessly on the work itself, letting her ideas and contributions speak, rather than addressing the airport incident directly. Gradually, starting as her technical abilities became evident, the awkwardness had receded. She had become known for her insights into quantum algorithms rather than as the girl whose dad blocked the runway at JFK. Thanks, Olivia replied to Sophia's invitation. Let me just finish this simulation and I'll join you there. As Sophia left, Olivia's phone buzzed with an incoming message from her father. The Reynolds Protocol for Equitable Travel was formally adopted by the International Air Transport Association today. 317 airlines worldwide have now committed to the standards. Thought you should know that your experience continues to create change. The message brought a mixture of emotions, pride in the positive impact that had emerged from a painful experience, but also a complex awareness of the privilege that had made that impact possible. Most people facing similar discrimination had no mechanism to force such comprehensive accountability. This awareness had shaped Olivia's evolving approach to her work and future goals. Her focus on medical diagnostic applications of quantum computing had intensified, driven by recognition that technological innovation could help address systemic inequities in healthcare access and outcomes. Her recent project, using quantum computing to develop diagnostic tools that could operate with minimal infrastructure requirements, was specifically designed to make advanced medical detection accessible in underserved communities worldwide. When she arrived in the restaurant 40 minutes later, Olivia found herself welcomed into a lively discussion among 8 other program participants. The conversation flowed naturally between technical debates about quantum decoherence, complaints about cafeteria food, and plans for an upcoming hackathon. Olivia, settle this for us, called Jason Kim from across the table. Sophia thinks quantum machine learning is just hype, but I maintain it's going to revolutionize predictive modeling within 5 years. The debate that followed was purely technical, focused entirely on the merits of competing approaches to quantum information processing rather than any external factors. It was exactly the kind of interaction Olivia had hoped for when applying to the program, being evaluated on her ideas rather than her identity or circumstances. As she walked back to her residence hall late that evening, Olivia reflected on how her perspective had evolved since that day on Flight 892. The humiliation she had experienced had not diminished her, but instead had crystallized her understanding of systems, power, and the mechanics of change. Her father had shown her that standing firm for dignity sometimes required extraordinary measures, but she had also come to recognize that true transformation required more than individual acts of resistance. It needed systematic rethinking of the structures that enabled discrimination in the first place. This insight had influenced not just her social justice perspective, but her approach to quantum computing itself. She had begun to see technological systems and social systems as parallel challenges, both requiring identification of fundamental patterns, recognition of emergent behaviors, and strategic intervention at key leverage points. Sometimes the most important coding we do is recoding how society treats people. She had said during a student symposium on technology and ethics, a perspective that was increasingly informing her research direction. As she entered her residence hall, Olivia passed a bulletin board where a flyer announced an upcoming lecture by the National Coalition for Aviation Diversity, the organization that had received the $10 million donation from Horizon Airlines as part of the settlement her father had negotiated. The incident that had threatened to derail her MIT opportunity had instead become a catalyst for industry-wide change, while simultaneously deepening her commitment to using her technical skills for broader social impact. In her room, Olivia opened her laptop to find an email from Boston General Hospital confirming her speaking slot at the Medical Research Symposium. The subject that had once been merely theoretical, using quantum computing to improve diagnostic accuracy for underserved populations, was now moving toward practical implementation. Before going to sleep, she sent a brief reply to her father's earlier message. The change matters, but what matters more is why we fought for it, not just for me, but for everyone who deserves dignity without needing a private jet to demand it. My diagnostic algorithm got selected for the Boston General Symposium next month. His response came quickly. Couldn't be prouder. Excellence is still the best response to prejudice. But now the world is a little more ready to recognize that excellence, without requiring extraordinary measures to prove it belongs. Olivia smiled as she set her phone aside. 6 months after the incident that could have defined her in others' eyes, she had reclaimed her narrative through the quality of her work and the clarity of her purpose. The MIT program had been everything she had hoped for intellectually, but the lessons from that day at Kennedy Airport about dignity, systems, and transformative change had provided an education equally valuable to anything she had learned about quantum computing. 1 year later, industry transformation. 1 year to the day after Flight 892's dramatic departure from Kennedy Airport. The aviation industry gathered for the first international summit on equitable travel practices in Washington, DEMO-ROC. The conference ballroom at the Mayflower Hotel was filled with airline executives, federal regulators, civil rights advocates, and academic researchers, an unprecedented convergence of stakeholders brought together by the systemic changes catalyzed by what was now commonly referred to as the Reynolds intervention. Transportation Secretary Elena Fuentes stood at the podium, surveying the assembled industry leaders before beginning her keynote address. Behind her, the conference banner displayed the new industry certification mark, a stylized aircraft silhouette with an equal sign in its center, the visual symbol of the Reynolds Protocol that had transformed aviation practices worldwide. 1 year ago today, she began, a 17-year-old girl with a valid first-class ticket was removed from a commercial flight because another passenger didn't believe she belonged there. What followed was not just a dramatic display of parental protection, but a fundamental recalibration of how this industry approaches its basic responsibility to treat all passengers with equal dignity. On the main screen behind her, key metrics from the past year appeared. Discrimination complaints, down 62% industry-wide. Implementation of the Reynolds Protocol, adopted by 317 airlines globally. Passenger satisfaction ratings increased across all demographic groups. Bias-related incident costs, reduced by 84%, $247 million in savings. Industry investment in equitable practices training, $432 million. These numbers tell a compelling story. Secretary Fuentes continued. Beyond the moral imperative, the business case for systematic reform has been definitively established. Treating all passengers with equal dignity is not just ethically right. It's operationally efficient and financially prudent. In the front row, James Reynolds listened with measured satisfaction. The transformation he had forced through his unprecedented runway blockade had exceeded even his most optimistic projections. The Reynolds Protocol for Equitable Travel, initially developed as part of Horizon Airlines' settlement agreement and subsequently refined through collaboration with civil rights organizations and regulatory agencies, had become the global standard for preventing discriminatory practices in commercial aviation. Its key provisions had been implemented across carriers worldwide: independent passenger advocacy, dedicated personnel with authority to override gate agent decisions in potential discrimination cases, bias recognition training, mandatory quarterly sessions for all customer-facing staff, with performance metrics tied to equitable treatment outcomes, documentation requirements, strict protocols for passenger removal decisions, requiring multiple levels of verification and explicit justification unrelated to protected characteristics, transparent reporting, public disclosure of discrimination complaint data, resolution processes, and preventive measures implemented. Diverse oversight review boards, including representatives from civil rights organizations, to evaluate policies and practices for potential discriminatory impacts. For Horizon Airlines specifically, the transformation had been particularly profound. After initially suffering catastrophic financial and reputational damage, the carrier had embraced comprehensive reform with a commitment that transformed it from industry laggard to recognized leader in equitable practices. The company's new CEO, appointed after the previous leadership team resigned amid the crisis, had made implementation of the Reynolds Protocol the centerpiece of a broader corporate reset. Their training programs were now being licensed to other carriers, creating a new revenue stream from what had initially been a forced compliance measure. Most significantly, the data had revealed an unexpected business benefit when discriminatory practices were eliminated. Operational efficiency actually improved. Without the delays, disruptions, and resource diversions caused by bias-related incidents, airlines were finding that flights departed on time more consistently. Customer satisfaction increased across all demographics, and the costs associated with passenger complaints decreased dramatically. What we've learned, explained William Harrington, now serving as Horizon's Chief Diversity Officer, during a panel discussion following Secretary Fuentes' keynote, is that discrimination wasn't just morally wrong, it was operationally inefficient. The resources we previously dedicated to managing the fallout from bias-related incidents are now being invested in service improvements that benefit all passengers. This business case for equity had proven particularly effective in securing industry-wide adoption of reforms that moral arguments alone had failed to achieve for decades. When discrimination became expensive through regulatory penalties, litigation costs, and operational disruptions, institutional motivation for change had followed naturally. In a concurrent session focusing on data analytics, researchers presented findings from comprehensive studies of passenger experiences across demographic categories. Pre-Reynolds Protocol. Black first-class passengers were 8.4 times more likely to have their credentials questioned than white counterparts, explained Dr. Sophia Williams, lead researcher on the Federal Aviation Administration's Equitable Travel Initiative. Post-implementation, that disparity has been reduced by 91%, with continued improvement as training and accountability systems mature. Similar improvements were documented across other metrics, disparities in upgrade approvals. Response times to service requests and enforcement of baggage policies had all narrowed significantly under the new protocols. For the passengers themselves, the impact was measured not just in statistics, but in the fundamental experience of travel. Focus group data revealed that minority travelers reported feeling more welcome and less scrutinized in premium cabins, while survey responses showed increased willingness to purchase first-class tickets among groups that had previously avoided such purchases despite financial ability. The most significant transformation, noted civil rights attorney Michael Johnson during an afternoon panel, isn't just in airline practices, but in accountability mechanisms. Pre-Reynolds, discriminatory incidents were typically addressed through damage control rather than structural change. Now, there are concrete consequences for discriminatory actions and concrete rewards for equitable practices. Indeed, the regulatory framework surrounding commercial aviation had been fundamentally reshaped. Congressional hearings in the months following the Kennedy Airport incident had led to substantive legislative action, including the Equitable Air Travel Act of 2026, which established new federal standards for non-discriminatory treatment of passengers. The Department of Transportation had created a specialized division focused specifically on aviation civil rights compliance, with enhanced enforcement powers and more substantial penalties for violations. What had previously been treated primarily as customer service issues were now recognized as civil rights concerns with appropriate regulatory oversight. As the summit's first day concluded with a reception in the hotel's grand ballroom, James Reynolds found himself approached by Gregory Hansen, the former airport director at Kennedy who had been on duty during the runway blockade. 1 year later, and I still can't decide whether what you did was brilliant or insane, Gregory said with a wry smile, extending his hand. James shook it firmly. Perhaps a bit of both, he acknowledged, but necessary. Can't argue with the results, Gregory admitted, though I hope you understand why I can't officially endorse runway blockades as a standard response to discrimination. Let's hope they remain unnecessary, James replied. The point was to make discrimination expensive enough that prevention becomes the rational choice. Their conversation was interrupted by an announcement that the evening's featured speaker had arrived, Olivia Reynolds, now a rising star in quantum computing and an unexpected symbol of the movement for equitable treatment in public spaces. As Olivia took the podium, poised and confident at 18, the transformation of the past year came full circle. What had begun as a humiliating experience for one young woman had catalyzed changes that would benefit countless passengers for generations to come. Systems only change, Olivia began, echoing her father's frequent insight, when the cost of continuing bad behavior exceeds the cost of reform. 1 year ago today, my father made discrimination expensive enough that reform became the rational choice. The assembled industry leaders, many of whom had initially resisted the changes now being celebrated, applauded with genuine enthusiasm. The business case for equity had been established so convincingly that even the most profit-focused executives now recognized the value proposition in treating all passengers with equal dignity. It was perhaps the most significant legacy of the Reynolds intervention, transforming equity from a moral aspiration to an operational imperative. 1 year and 3 months after the incident that had changed the aviation industry, Olivia Reynolds found herself once again at Kennedy Airport, preparing to board a Horizon Airlines flight to Boston. The symmetry was not lost on her. Same airline, same route, same first-class cabin, but nearly everything else had transformed. The morning sunlight streamed through the terminal's vast windows, creating patterns on the polished floor as passengers moved through the familiar choreography of air travel. For Olivia, the scene carried echoes of that fateful day, but the context had shifted dramatically. As she approached the gate, Olivia noticed the visible changes implemented under the Reynolds protocol. The check-in counter now displayed a prominent sign explaining passenger rights and the multiple channels for reporting concerns about treatment. A uniformed passenger advocate, a position that hadn't existed before the protocol, stood nearby, identified by a distinctive badge that represented the new layer of oversight implemented across the industry. "Good morning, Ms. Reynolds," the gate agent greeted her, scanning her boarding pass with professional courtesy. "You're in seat 14A. We're beginning pre-boarding in about 15 minutes. There was no suspicion in the agent's eyes. No hesitation about Olivia's right to occupy a first-class seat. Her belonging in that space was assumed rather than questioned, precisely the equal treatment that should have been standard all along. As she waited in the gate area, Olivia noticed a digital display highlighting Horizon's implementation of the Reynolds protocol, part of the airline's ongoing effort to rebuild its reputation after the discrimination incident. What had begun as a crisis response had evolved into a corporate identity. The airline now positioned itself as an industry leader in equitable practices. Olivia's phone vibrated with an incoming call from her father. "Just checking in," James said when she answered. "Everything going smoothly." "Perfectly normal," Olivia replied with a smile. "No private jets necessary this time." And the joke carried the comfortable understanding that had deepened between them since the incident. James had shown her that day that her dignity was worth fighting for, even to extraordinary lengths. But they both recognized that the real victory wasn't in the dramatic intervention, but in the systematic changes that made such interventions unnecessary. Your symposium presentation made the science section of the Times. By the way, James mentioned, his pride evident even through the phone connection. They're calling your quantum diagnostic algorithm a potential breakthrough for rural healthcare access. The recognition of her work, entirely separate from the aviation incident that had briefly defined her in the public eye, meant more to Olivia than any of the attention that had followed the Kennedy Airport confrontation. This was achievement on her own terms, recognition earned through intellectual contribution rather than circumstance. The Boston General team wants to begin clinical trials next quarter, Olivia shared. If the results match our simulations, we could see implementation in underserved communities within 18 months. As they continued discussing her research, boarding began for Flight 892. Olivia joined the first-class line, her MIT Quantum Computing Lab ID badge visible on the lanyard around her neck, a subtle but unmistakable marker of her professional identity and earned place in that intellectual community. The boarding process proceeded smoothly, efficiently, without incident. As Olivia settled into seat 14A, the same seat assignment that had been the center of controversy over a year ago, she was struck by how ordinary the experience felt. The flight attendant offered her a pre-departure beverage with the same professional courtesy extended to every first-class passenger, regardless of age, race, or appearance. This normality was the true victory, the right to exist in spaces without having one's belonging questioned based on prejudiced assumptions. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Olivia looked out the window at the sprawling Kennedy Airport complex. Somewhere out there was the exact spot where her father's G700 had positioned itself to block this very flight, a moment of extraordinary intervention that had catalyzed ordinary but profound change. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Carlos Rodriguez, the Hispanic businessman who had attempted to intervene during their original incident and had since become a family friend. Saw your research in the Times. Brilliant work. Safe travels. The connection that had formed through that difficult experience had evolved into a meaningful professional relationship. Carlos now served on the advisory board of the National Coalition for Aviation Diversity and had become a mentor to Olivia as she navigated the intersections of technology, business, and social impact. As Flight 892 taxied toward the runway, the same runway 31L that had been blocked by her father's jet, Olivia felt a sense of completion. The journey that had begun in humiliation and injustice had transformed into something powerful and constructive, not just for her personally, but for the countless passengers who would never have to experience what she had endured that day. The aircraft accelerated down the runway, lifting smoothly into the clear morning sky. As the Manhattan skyline came into view briefly before the plane banked northeast toward Boston, Olivia sent a final text to her father, "Dad, we changed something." His response came moments before she switched her phone to airplane mode. "You changed something? I just made sure they paid attention." As Flight 892 climbed to its cruising altitude, Olivia Reynolds turned her attention to the quantum computing research notes on her tablet. The discriminatory incident that could have defined her had instead become merely one chapter in a much larger story, one she was writing through her own excellence, innovation, and determination to create systems that worked equitably for everyone. The private jet intervention had forced a moment of accountability, but the lasting transformation had come through the mundane, essential work of changing protocols, training staff, establishing oversight, and creating consequences for discrimination. In the end, the most powerful legacy of that dramatic day wasn't the spectacle of a billionaire blocking a runway with his private jet, but the unremarkable experience of a young Black woman boarding a flight without having her right to be there questioned, a simple dignity now extended to countless passengers who would never know how it had been secured. This isn't just a story about a billionaire's dramatic response to discrimination. It's about what happens when someone with power uses that power to force accountability that benefits everyone. Most of us don't have private jets to deploy when faced with injustice, but we all have voices, phones with cameras, and the ability to document and share our experiences. The Reynolds Protocol now protects all passengers precisely because one incident was documented, elevated, and transformed into systemic change. Have you witnessed discrimination while traveling? What did you do? Did you speak up, stay silent, or record what happened? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story could help others recognize and respond effectively to similar situations. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Discrimination thrives in silence and isolation, but loses power when exposed to light and accountability. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications to join a community dedicated to sharing stories that matter. Stories that challenge us to think differently about power, privilege, and the responsibility that comes with both. Remember, systems only change when maintaining the status quo becomes more expensive than reform. Today, we've seen how one father made discrimination too costly to continue. Tomorrow, it could be your voice that creates the next breakthrough for justice.